I think the key thing, I'm going to try and give you some basics, all right? So the basics that I'm going to try and give you today is just to more or less understand how a tree uses water, or how most plants in general use water. The one thing we need to understand before we can start irrigating or whatever we want to try and do is to understand how our plants lose water. And I think if you've got a good understanding of these basics, you can make some good informed decisions of what the way forward is. All right, so I'm going to try and manage a mic and a pointer and some props in between. I am someone that likes learning with pictures, but basically what I want to show to you today is basically this glass of water. Okay, the water in the glass itself is going to represent the soil. The little straw in the glass is going to represent the plant. And I'm going to be playing the role of the atmosphere today. All right. So what we want to try and understand is what the interaction is between the soil, the plant, and the atmosphere, and how all of that combines together in trying to understand how the plant loses water. Good. So we often refer to this as the soil-plant-atmosphere continuum, and it's going to be extremely small up there on the stage, but don't worry about the picture. Basically what we're going to try and look at what the atmosphere does, what the plant does, and what the soil and the roots do together in taking up water in a normal environmental situation. So let's look at, I thought of doing it top down. Let's look at the atmosphere first and then work towards the plant, then look at the soil last. Alrighty. So the first one is we have to try and understand the atmosphere. So trying to understand the atmosphere is pretty difficult. We as humans aren't that great at understanding the atmosphere. And I'll prove it to you in these next few slides though. So some of the things we can look at most of the time, we are good at telling temperature. We assume we're good at telling temperature. And the bus yesterday, we would have said, it's hot. All right, it was hot in the bus. All right. Today we would be saying, it's a fair day outside. It's fairly cool, so we can differentiate between hot or cold. All right. And the same with humidity. We can say, am I sweating like in the bus yesterday, or am I actually quite dry and my sinuses are burning a bit because the air is dry? All right. We can make those types of differentiations. And is it a beach day in terms of wind? Or am I standing in the field and wishing I've got windbreaks day? It's that type of things. We can't really go out and say, I think the wind is 39.75 kilometers per hour. We're not good at that. We are not made to sense those types of environmental variables. Some other animals might be a little bit better than that, but some not. But we're pretty poor at it. We, however, never refer to the following. So those things like vapor pressure deficit. Me and Dan in the morning when we wake up and we wake up in that hotel room, go outside for coffee, I'll tell Dan, did you hear it's a high vapor pressure deficit day today? And Dan will go, yeah, no, I heard. It's a good one. People don't talk to one another like that. It's not something we use on a day-to-day basis, and therefore we never have a good feel for what vapor pressure deficit is. And the same thing, it goes to potential evapotranspiration. Again, me and Dan might. We go, did you hear the potential evapotranspiration today is 6 millimeters? And Dan would say, yes, I think it's beer time, eh? And 6 millimeters, we need some beer or something like that. It's not something that goes around commonly. We've got no feel for it. But those two parameters at the bottom is basically what plants respond to. So if you want to understand plants, you basically need to understand vapor pressure deficit and potential evapotranspiration. And we'll go through some of these environmental variables because getting a good feel for these is going to give you a good indication of what plants see. So you have to put yourself in the plant's roots, not shoes though. Put yourself in that situation and try and see what the plant sees. Okay. So, temperature and humidity. So, does anybody think they're good at sensing temperature? Nobody. All right. It's dead quiet this time of the morning usually. So, you're good with hot and cold? All right. We'll go through a little bit of test today. All right. So, what I would like to do is if you, just where you're sitting now, could you touch the table in front of you, just the top of the table, and then on your chair, just next to your chair, touch the steel part of the chair? Which one is hotter and which one's colder? You see, you're all pretty bad at sensing temperature though, eh? Because they're exactly at the same room temperature. All right? They're exactly the same room temperature. Everybody, prove the point, we're pretty bad at sensing temperature. We can sense if something's hot or cold, but it's at the same temperature. And the only thing is, the wood is not conducting heat that well, so it's not taking the energy away from your skin, and therefore it feels warmer, whereas the steel will take that temperature from your skin. It's stealing that temperature. So we can sense fluxes, we can sense differences in temperature, but we can definitely not sense temperature. So it's a miracle that we survived to this point though. So if somebody tells you global warming, they can't sense warming. They're not good. They can sense changes, so they can tell you climate change. That's why they went from global warming to climate change. But I was looking at some of the television in some of these motel rooms. So I was looking at Titanic. I think I've seen it 6 times now in the 2-week period that I was here. It was running 6 times on public television. And I got this picture. If you're showering at the good temperature and the warm water just disappears for a second there, and it's a 1 degree colder water running over you, you're like Jack and Rose, and Jack telling Rose, please just don't let me go in that shower. So we're good at sensing those differences in temperature. If the water in the shower goes colder, you can sense it. But you can't tell if the water is at 100 degrees Celsius or at 2 degrees Celsius, but you can feel those changes. And that's why, we need to try and understand these things better and see how plants would see it. So what impact does high or low temperatures have on plants? So if the temperatures are very high, I always take this back to cars. I'm not a good mechanic or any type of mechanical engineer though. If a car is running hot, okay, it's running very hot, you get damage to the motor. It's run out of water, it's running pretty hot, and the engine seizes and a whole bunch of other factors are running around there. So same with plants. If the engine's very hot, it leads to a degeneration of proteins. Okay, and those proteins you need to make sugars and a whole bunch of other factors. So high temperatures are not good for plants. But similar to low temperatures, if you are starting your car, there's no antifreeze in the car. Older cars, now I don't think new cars don't start anymore, but older cars, you go there, it's cold in the morning, you try and start it, it doesn't want to start. Continue trying to start it, doesn't want to start. If the system is cold, the system won't run, and that's exactly. So there's an optimal temperature in plants where good plant growth it takes place. So low temperatures would limit growth of plants. And the same with humidity. I think we're pretty good. We can tell it's humid today or it's not humid, but we're not good at knowing exactly how humid or not humid it is. We usually refer to our cell phone apps and we go, yesterday we were sitting in the bus, Leonie was sitting next to me, and we were sweating like crazy. And she went on to her phone and she said, it must be about 85% humidity, and the phone app is like, no, it's 40% humidity, which is completely nonsense. But we are highly dependent on measuring equipment to tell us how humid or not it is. But relative humidity, it's exactly what it says. It's measuring how much water is in the air. So if it's very humid, there will be more water in the air, and if it's less humid, there's less water in the air. And that has a profound impact on plants. High humidity, it means you've got softer leaves, so you'll typically see plants that have evolved in a high humidity area. Bananas, for example. Have you seen bananas have these soft leaves? They're good, they're doing well under high humidity areas. You grow much better bananas in a humid area than you grow bananas in a dry area, because in a dry area, they dry out too quickly. So in a low humidity area, you usually have less pathogens, but the leaves of that specific plant is a lot hardier. You go into the outback, you go and look at some of the shrubs there, if you're ever around they're pretty hard leaves. They're extremely hard, leathery leaves, and they're used to those low humidity environments, and they don't dry out as quickly. But that's an adaptation that's taken years and years and years to get there. Everybody happy up till this point? Good stuff. So you'll see in front of you, you should have got a little VPD chart, okay? And we're going to be, referring to vapor pressure deficit for quite some time during these presentations. But what vapor pressure deficit basically is, it's this combination between temperature and humidity, all right? And it takes a little bit of explaining. It's not something we're used to, so we will spend a little bit of time trying to understand what vapor pressure deficit is. And you look at this graph, and it just tells you. I always tell people, in the South African context, and I'll try and make it the same here, is if I am in Yamba today, and it's 35 degrees Celsius in Yamba today, the humidity is 65%. Is it, what does it feel like? What's the real feel index? Okay, today here, is it versus 35 degrees Celsius in the outback? It's two different types of heat that you're feeling though, hey? It's a warm, humid heat here and a very dry heat up in the outback. It's two different scenarios. It's still 35 degrees Celsius, but it's two different environments and you feel differently. And that's where your vapor pressure deficit comes and takes all of these factors into account. Okay? And don't worry about these figures too much. And the stuff there at the bottom is not necessarily for macadamias, but it might as well be. All right, it's pretty close to what macadamias will respond to as well. But I'll explain to you what vapor pressure deficit is. So it's the relationship between temperature and humidity, and it basically tells you, and I'll try to explain this the best I can. It basically tells you what the difference is between completely saturated air, so air with a lot of moisture in it, versus dry or the current situation of the air. Okay, so I've been trying to explain this in the previous courses as follows. So my mouth is pretty dry at this stage, okay, but I'm going to take some water, I'm going to drink it, put it in my mouth, swirl it around a little bit, and then my mouth's going to be at 100% saturation. Okay, so there's a lot of water in my mouth. Good? Okay, so now there's water in my mouth. If I keep on talking and I lose a little bit of this water, it's going to continuously dry out. And the difference between my mouth being dry and completely wet is what vapor pressure deficit is. It's the difference between what the air is around us now, or the feel in my mouth now, and what it could potentially hold. Okay, I know it's not intuitive. We'll look at a simple example and you'll understand better of what we're trying to do. Okay, so it basically tells you how thirsty the environment is. If the environment is very thirsty, so the vapor pressure deficit is very high, there's a deficit in vapor. Do we get that? So there's not water vapor, the atmosphere is extremely dry, it means it's very thirsty. If my mouth is very dry, I'm going to drink a lot more water than if my mouth is completely wet. Okay, and that's what we try and understand. So imagine a towel. You just went to the beach, you rinse that towel, and the towel's completely soaking wet. Okay, you put it on a clothesline at home, the towel's hanging there, and you've got two different scenarios. Okay, if the vapor pressure deficit is low, okay, it means there's a lot of moisture. Does it make sense? The vapor deficit, there's not a big deficit in the atmosphere. It's one of these overcast days. The humidity is pretty high, but there's a lot of moisture. You can feel the moisture in the air. If you put that towel on the clothesline, it's going to dry out over a lot longer period. It'll stay damp for quite a while to get that towel dry. All right. If you go and take that same towel on a clear sky, sunny day, and it's dry, the air is extremely dry, and you hang that same wet towel on the clothesline, it'll dry out like this. Okay. Within an hour, that towel's dry. And that's exactly what vapor pressure deficit is. So it's just an indication of how thirsty the environment is. If the environment's very thirsty, vapor pressure deficit's high. If it's not as thirsty, vapor pressure deficit is low. Everybody on the same page when it comes to vapor pressure deficit. Okay. Lost all my tools. All right. Then one of the last atmospheric factors we're looking at is potential evapotranspiration. Does anybody know? Has anybody got a feel? Have you used this before? Potential evapotranspiration? Okay. So potential evapotranspiration is basically some scientists which most of them are pretty high on drugs, when they come up with these formulas. So they've come up with a formula with a bunch of Greek letters, which very few people understand. Then you plug in temperature, humidity, solar radiation, wind speed, all these factors you plug into an equation, and it's going to tell you how much water can be lost from a grass surface on a single day. So basically, on a single day, how much water does the environment take from you? Okay, that's basically what potential evapotranspiration is. So on a day, it puts a value to that. And it's just potential. It's usually in millimeters per hour. You can go and work it out for every hour, how much water is being lost to the atmosphere, or on a daily basis. We usually take daily basis, a value over a daily basis. But if you go to any of your weather station, if you just go to weather station data in your area, you will get a number for this. There will always be a potential evapotranspiration number. Okay. So I'll try and explain to you in the next slides why macadamias are increasingly becoming more irrigated, and especially in South Africa, why they're irrigated in South Africa. Okay. Is everybody comfortable up to this point where we are now? So any questions? All right. It's going to go. 11. We're done at 11 though. Good stuff. So this is a world map. I don't know if I'm going to sit down so everybody can see, but this is a world map of potential evapotranspiration. And I'm still struggling with geography though, but that's all right. I would have hoped by this time I've got it under the knee. But more or less there is where I'm staying in Nelspruit, that little dot there. And on a yearly basis, we'll typically lose anything from 1,500 millimeters to 1,750 or 700. 1.5 to 1.7 millimeters is what South Africa will lose, or my area where I'm staying will lose every year. That will go into the atmosphere. It will be used by plants and all those types of things. Okay? Now, please help me here. Somebody was telling me the previous time the horn there is Byron Bay. Higher up, there, more or less there as we are. More. Oh no, it looks like I've got Parkinson's up here. It's just difficult. All right, but we're somewhere around that area. And if you look at what's going on here, you're more or less sitting in that 1,500 to 1,750. It's difficult to see it on the map here, but you're losing the same amount of water that we'd be losing in South Africa under these conditions. But if you keep a close eye now, if I go to the next map, you'll look at rainfall. Okay, so this is the amount that's being lost. The environment's losing this. If we do rainfall on top of this, you might see a much different picture. Okay, we put rainfall on top of here, and then you'll see my rainfall area where I'm staying is about 725 to about, I can't even read there, 900. Okay, if we're lucky, we're getting to 900 millimeters. Do you realize then that if we're getting to 900 in a good year, there's still a deficit there of about 600 millimeters? The environment's taken 600 millimeters more than we're actually getting in. It's simple budgeting though. It's accounting. This is how much of money you're getting in, this amount of money going out. So the amount of money or rain in this scenario that we're getting in is less than what we're losing every single year. Does this make sense? Okay. So that's why South African farmers have no choice but to irrigate. So they're always running at a constant deficit. They're just losing more water than they're actually getting in. in a normal year, pre-climate change now, you guys would have been sitting within that 1,500 to 2.5 meters of rain. Normal year, right? This is more or less what the area would be getting. So you either just on par with the amount of water that's being lost in to the atmosphere, or even slightly over sometimes of what's being lost to the atmosphere. And that's why everything is always so green around here and it's looking nice, because you're not sitting in a major deficit. So I don't know if anybody's followed the news about a year back or so, and I'm pretty sure you can do it for Sydney. I'm not going to try and wager my bets on geography where Sydney is in this. But South Africa, Cape Town sitting more or less there at the bottom, in that corner there. And Cape Town ran out of water last year. They were close to day zero, where there was just no water for people anymore. And what it basically came down to is that they have a evapotranspiration, so a loss of about 2,000, anything from 1,700 to 2,000 millimeters of water being lost every single year in Cape Town. Okay, you know how much rain they're getting? Overlay that, more or less 370 to 400 millimeters of rain. And that is where you're seeing the loss is so great. The atmosphere and the environment takes so much water from that specific area that it's constantly running in a shortage. So if it doesn't rain one year, they're relying on groundwater reserves or a lot of other reserves to actually keep them going. And that's why these desert areas, they're deserts, because the rainfall they're getting is much less than the amount of water they're losing. Shout.
So that graph that you've got up there now, that's all to do with just BGO based on the law.
Yeah.
Grass.
Yep. It's not, so there's shortfalls to using potential evapotranspiration, because trees and a whole bunch of other factors will behave differently to a grass surface. But what it basically comes down to is giving you an indication of the amount of water that's being lost. Yes. Oh, yes. The question was, is this the graph we're putting on in the front? Is this based then on just water loss from a grass surface? Correct? Yeah. Alrighty. Everybody understand more or less why irrigation is becoming more and more popular? Because we're constantly running into some of these deficits now. And that's why people are trying to mitigate the risk that they're running. All right, so we've done the atmosphere. Is everybody comfortable with where we are with the atmosphere? Any questions before we move on from the atmosphere? Nothing. Okay, good. So the next one is pretty much, it's the interesting one. It's my little straw here. And the little straw is what a lot of us specialize in for many years, in trying to understand how the straw works. And this straw is not too different between different plants. Most plants, they differ in leaf size and canopy size and a whole bunch of other factors, different roots and all the blah blah, but they more or less use water in exactly the same way. It has to go through the straw. Water is being sucked through the straw. And the straw then, it consists of roots, stems, and leaves. And what we will be looking at now, the first part we'll be looking at is understanding the stem and the leaf component. Okay, so I'm going to try and do this. If this is the soil, it's full of water, it's doing well, I've irrigated my crop, or I've had a lot of rainfall, and I suck water through the straw now. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to suck the water through the straw. The atmosphere is dry, so the atmosphere is thirsty. It's sucking water through the straw though. At the top of the straw is just basically an irrigation pipe, whatever you want to call it, it's a straw. At the top of the straw, in macadamias and other crops, there's a little valve, okay? And those valves in macadamias, and my leaf here, those valves sit on the bottom part of macadamia leaves, and we refer to them as stomata. Everybody is happy with the stomata thing, right? Okay? So those valves, they basically control the amount of water that's being lost by the plant. Okay. My question to you then is, thinking about this, if my glass is full and my straws are happy, Why would I need a valve? If this glass constantly stays full, why would I need a valve at the end of the straw? Why would the straw need to be open or closed at the tip?
Because at night time, the atmospheric conditions change.
Yes, it changes at night. But even if it doesn't change at night, why would I want to stop water loss? So why would I want to stop the system from losing water? If I've got enough water, the water is unlimited forever.
You'd have to prime it sometimes.
For what? It's an open system. It can lose water till infinity if it doesn't have a valve. So why would we want to stop losing water?
I think it will have some sort of side effect of using too much of one thing.
Okay, so
Maybe it will create this problem, that problem internally, and or it will be for
Definitely.
example, if you drink too much alcohol, it's unlimited. You can drink as much, but finally you will get dehydrated.
yeah, that is it is. But we're talking about systems which, even though they're living, they're based on hydraulic principles. So, it's just a straw. Don't. He's not got feelings. It's a straw with water, eh? And if the atmosphere keeps on sucking, and there's water at the bottom, I can drink water. The atmosphere can drink water infinitely. So why would it want a valve? It is definitely. There's a relationship with photosynthesis. So what happens if I lose water, and I've been saying this to everyone, if I lose water, I actually am paying the mafia a little bit. So I'm giving some of this water for productivity. Okay, and that's why transpiration, so the loss of water through the leaf, is adding to productivity. It's a beneficial water loss. So the more you can transpire, the more product you're making, like a little windmill churning though. It's going tick, 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 every drop of water I'm losing. All right. So what I want to say to you is that why do I need to close basically comes down, there's another. It's not, most of this is not really an energy intensive process, using water or losing water. It's basically just suction. So all of that energy sitting in the atmosphere. So it's not a lot of energy needing to go through this. It's a simple system. But the biggest limitation to this entire thing is it's hydraulic safety. So I've been trying to explain this in terms of an irrigation system. All right. So it might take a little bit of a time understanding this, but as everybody had some experience, even in your house with installing a pipeline and a pump with pressure and all the rest of the stuff. Somebody's had experience with that. And basically what happens in an irrigation system or in a normal household system, you're relying on pressure being pushed through a pump. Okay, so through a pipe. So I'm going to be the pump now, the pressure pump. I'm going to be on this side of the straw, and I'm going to blow on this thing. Okay, so basically this is the system. I'm going to push pressure on this side, and something needs to come out on the other side. Okay, so if I just see, and what happens if the pressure on the side of the pump is higher than what the pipes can hold? The pipe just bursts. That's what happens, okay? Everybody's happy with that concept. But in plants, it's a little bit different. In plants, water is being sucked through the straw. Okay, so what happens if I close the straw on this side? Okay, so I'm running out of water, okay? Or even I'm not running out of water. I just can't suck this hard. I'm going to drown, most likely, okay? But it's like this, and I continuously suck harder and harder and harder and harder on the straw. What's going to happen to the straw? It collapses, eh? It sucks it in. So if I'm going to close it, I'm going to try it. I've tried it with those paper ones. They don't work so well, and it doesn't work with the stainless steel ones. Plastic ones work, though. All right, so it's going to go like this. You see it turns flat? The straw goes, closes down. So if this environment is such a strong beast sucking on the straw, the plant needs to give something at some stage. So to protect all these straws in the plant, it needs to shut that valve. It needs to say, I can't give you more water. You're going to cause a collapse in my hydraulic system. Does that make sense? Have I lost everyone? It makes sense, though. Hey? All right.
So basically, it's the ability of the roots to uptake moisture is what that valve's controlling.
So exactly, it's the ability. The comment is it's the ability of the roots. It's the ability of the roots, and then the stem, and then the ability of the plant to move water through that stem. If this straw was a lot thicker, so I had a 50 mil pipe in here. I don't know how I'll get my mouth over it, but how do you suck that pipe to go in? You have to suck very hard. But in a tree, it's all these small little straws being put together, and it's the ability to get water through them which requires a valve then. And that's why you need the valve. The valve controls the amount of water that the plant can actually take up, move through that plant, and then easily lose to the atmosphere. Okay, so there's a hydraulic limitation. Plant can only move so much water through the straw. Okay. I hope I haven't lost everyone though. Okay. So there's my little valve. It doesn't happen that quickly. It doesn't happen that quickly though. Okay. So if the biggest question now is, if the environment is continuously thirsty and the glass is always full, you'll expect that relationship is linear, okay? So the stomata open as the demand for water opens. So the atmosphere wants more and more water, the valve opens at a maximum, and then water just gets lost all the way through the system. It's just continuously sucking. That's what we would expect to happen. But now, given that I've shown you that the hydraulic limitations of the tree won't be able to meet that, if the atmosphere wants too much, the plant will start shutting down. It'll only give a certain amount of water to the atmosphere at any given condition. Makes sense, right? I hope so. All right. So, this is all linked to the hydraulic capabilities of the tree. And one thing we should try and remember is that if you've got an irrigation system at your house, or a water pump or something putting pressure into the system, if it's giving too much pressure, what do? You go to the pump, you close the valve a little bit, and you choke the pump not to put as much pressure in the system. And this is exactly, the valve is just on the other side here. It's just closing that system down a little bit, not to get too much pressure in that stem running up and down. Protecting the hydraulic safety of the tree, or the hydraulic capabilities of the tree. Okay, so what happens within the tree? These are my small little straws inside the stem of the tree now. Okay, it collapses, but what happens now, if you look at this video, basically what happens is that the tree is sucking a bubble. You see that? Sit down, everybody see? Okay, it's going to rerun again. So that's a little air bubble that the tree sucks. Okay, and now everybody has to laugh at the joke because I've been telling it for so long. But you've never actually walked past a tree and you hear the tree fart. So you never get rid of that air in it, eh? And also you can't walk past it and the tree goes psst. It doesn't happen. Okay, so if that air bubble is in this little straw, it can never get rid of it. So you know what it does? It says, all right, I'm getting rid of that straw. I need to use another straw. And if it happens 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 times, if it loses all those straws, the tree will die.
Theunis, how many straws in the macadamia?
Oh, no. That's all to do with stem circumference. Okay, so depending on how big or small the stem is, but uncountable numbers, millions and millions and millions, okay, of these little straws. So, yes.
So, do you mean, is that visible when we see dieback?
Yes. The question is that what you see when you see dieback? Definitely. So when you see dieback and the top of the trees start going dead, or you see a branch going dead, a lot of the time it's because it's just not getting water to that anymore. So extremely big trees are just not able to pull all that water through the tree anymore because a lot of those straws have died. Okay. And when you get something like when you get Phytophthora in plants, goes into the roots, goes into the stem, and all the Phytophthora that goes into the stem is slowly killing these straws. And then it's starving the plant of more water going through and food going into the top of the tree. Question at the back.
Has there been much work done measuring the diameter of the xylem and the variation between, say, other crops?
There has been some work. The question is, has there been a lot of work done? in measuring the diameter of the xylem in macadamias and other crops. There has been a lot of work done, mostly by engineers. So engineers are much better at understanding hydraulic limitations in anything than biologists are. So the engineers have spent quite a lot of work in determining the diameter of the xylem. And the key thing is macadamias and most other subtropical crops, including citrus, have much smaller xylems than some of your temperate or deciduous crops like pecans or apples or wine grapes or those types of crops.
So Theunis, on a rudimentary level, is stem diameter a measure of tree health or tree hydraulic conductivity?
So that's, must I repeat the question? Yeah. So the question is it an indication of tree health, a stem diameter indication of tree health? Not necessarily an indication of tree health though. It's just an indication of the ability of that tree to transport water and nutrients. You will rarely see a big canopy of a tree being linked to a very small diameter stem. Okay, so the bigger the tree gets, so the more leaves it has to lose water from, the bigger the diameter gets of that to keep up with that. Okay.
And just on the topic of hydraulic limitations, so when designing the irrigation system, obviously height's a big one. Is there any real influence of tree height? I mean, I guess I'm talking from a Northern Rivers perspective.
Yeah, so the question is there any height limitation to this, especially the influences? It's a little bit different because you're working on a very small scale, so it's extremely thin pipes, and there's a lot of them running up into that tree. So some of I think Dan also mentioned at the previous time, some of the sequoias, those massive redwoods that you're getting, I mean, they're not limited necessarily by hydraulic capabilities. They're more limited by a whole bunch of other factors though. But tree height is very little limitation on this. They're not limited by the amount of water. There's an extreme amount of pressure that those trees can withstand. The pressure within this is excessive. So, I mean, some of this is 200, 300 bar and some of these components in the tree at which pressure is being pushed into the tree. And you've seen this as well. If the diameter of the straw was smaller, and I'll push it into the glass here, there'll be a little bit of capillary action coming up as well, which is aiding the tree in taking up water. So there's no real limitation to tree height. In most of the cases, there's not a big limitation. Question at the back.
And so, almost a bit back on the question before, what do you think is the difference between more temperate species and macadamias in drought tolerance?
Yes. Okay, so the question is what's the difference between drought tolerance between temperate species and then subtropical species like macadamias and citrus? And so they're saying, and that pretty much makes a lot of sense, but they're saying if you have macadamias, subtropical species, because they never lose their leaves, they're exposed to extremely wet conditions and extremely dry conditions all the same. They go through the entire seasonal cycle of what's happening, okay? And because that happens, they have a lot more of these smaller little pipes, and they can afford to run into that trouble. So losing 10 pipes like these out of 10 million is such a small percentage. Whereas if you go to deciduous crops, your pecans, for instance, the diameter of this is much bigger. So they don't have 10 million, they only have 10,000. And they can't really afford losing 10 out of 10,000. 10 out of 10,000 is a much bigger percentage than 10 out of 10 million. So drought tolerance, subtropical species with smaller diameter xylem are always more or better adapted to drought scenarios than some of your deciduous crops.
I'll actually probably use the technology to ask the vapor deficit tolerance on the heat tolerance.
Yep. So vapor pressure deficit. So what the vapor pressure deficit tolerance is, a lot of your temperate species, if this pipe is a little bit bigger than what macadamias is, if you can go back to that first or to that slide, they will have a much more linear relationship. So sugarcane is a good example for you. Sugarcane will run a very close relationship to that. Okay, we've got some big pipes running in the middle of that sugarcane. It's one big pipe almost running up, and that big pipe can transport a lot more water in a shorter time in response to vapor pressure deficit then. So if the demand is high, it could lose it pretty quickly because the stem or the diameter of the straw is much bigger. Whereas in macadamias, that hydraulic limitation becomes evident because it's smaller. No, there's a lot of resistance moving through small pipes. There's not a lot of resistance moving through big pipes.
The diameter.
So what's the difference? What is the effect of the hydrological pressure if the water is near the top of the surface of the soil, as distinct from, say, being 3 or 4 meters down as a result of a drought?
Yeah. So the question is, what's the difference in the hydrological pressure between water being on top of the soil versus water being right down? Yes. So everything depends on the proximity of that water to the root. So if you've got a very shallow rooted crop and it's only shallow rooted, so it's got no big tap roots, the further the soil dries out in that topsoil root layer, so the further the water moves away from the root, the more that pressure becomes to take up that water. Same, but in macadamias now, you've got that deep roots sitting in the wetter soil at the bottom. The pressure is not more or less when they close. It's or more or less depending on the dry topsoil or the roots at the bottom sitting in wet soil. It's about the proximity of the water to the root, which
so
is.
It doesn't require more energy to lift water from lower down.
No, it does not require more energy.
That's what
The atmospheric pull remains constant through that system. There was another question.
Oh, I was just saying, there must be a relationship between the size of the xylem and the amount of sap. So if you cut the limb off a fig tree, it bleeds everywhere. So they must have very big xylem, and the maca tree is the opposite. You cut the limb off and you nothing or almost.
Definitely. So there is a relationship between the amount of sap flow or the velocity, which Dan will show, the velocity of sap flow through a stem versus and the xylem thickness. So fig trees, they've also got softer leaves. So they softer leaves, they're used to losing high amounts of volumes throughout the day. If the environment wants it, the fig tree will lose it, and it will wilt pretty quickly though.
So, Theunis, if you're saying that tree height doesn't limit hydraulic conductivity, what about the age of wood? Does that limit the hydraulic conductivity?
Yes, the age of wood will limit hydraulic conductivity. Have I got some more straws here? Oh. Doesn't matter. The biggest, I'll be with you now, Robbie. So the biggest thing is the age of wood will limit it. So the bigger the stem becomes, the more non-conducting straws there will become. So there will be a certain part in the wood, especially in the middle, we refer to that as heartwood, and that heartwood is never conducting. So it stops conducting water. So as the trees become older, the portion of wood conducting sap is becoming less and less. Robbie's got a question.
Yeah, okay, just sorry to challenge you.
The previous group was stomata, so we are in a different level.
Nice question. A tall tree may not be any less efficient in the pull of that water, but there's a huge amount of wasted, huge amount higher water wasted and stored in that trunk system compared to the leaves, wouldn't there be?
Definitely. So there's a lot of storage capacity in a big tree, though.
So it's actually an inefficient system because there's all this wasted.
It is. It's going to be an inefficient system. Big trees, they're not necessarily, if they're well watered, and there is a lot of water, they're not necessarily that inefficient. It's still a good system because it's got an increased leaf area as well, increased amounts of bearing wood if it's a big tree. given that it's well managed. It's not a badly managed.
Is a big irrigation system with a bigger pump that needs to be primed and perhaps bigger feeder pipes any more efficient than the smaller one? No, it just requires that initial priming, and then the efficiency is dependent on the design of the system, not the size of the system.
Not necessarily, because that big pump, you might lose half a meg of water sitting in those pipes compared to 0.1 meg of the small pipe. But
you're not using it effectively.
Within your system, because you might only have 0.6 meg, so your ability to move through there. So your air cells that you're talking about on your higher trunk, you can have a much greater ability, high risk to those air pockets with a longer trunk than a shorter one.
No, I don't think so, Robbie. Tree height is a little bit of a difficult one. The water is never lost if it's in the system. It's just, I think, building onto that question, maybe I'm answering your question or the question here now, but what I would say, what it comes down to is that if you're running into trouble, so if water was unlimited, both of the systems, either big or small, would be equally efficient. Yeah, so if water is not unlimited, the real answer to the question is, will big trees be more resilient or less resilient to that drought? And a big tree will be less resilient to drought than a small tree, depending on a bunch of factors, where if there's subsoil moisture, but if they're equally running out of water, so that glass and both of them are equally, like a big tree is getting this amount of water and the small tree is getting this amount of water. The small tree will make more effective use of this amount of water than the big tree will.
And that's got nothing to do with the energy requirement.
That's got nothing to do with the energy requirement. It's just there's such an increased amount of leaf area to lose water from. So the big tree will drink this glass in a day, and that small tree will drink this glass in 3 to 4 days.
Well, just say you had the same canopy size, but it was shifted up 5 metres taller. You've got an extra 5 metres of stem in there. It's not so much the energy required to pull the water through that stem, but that extra biomass of stem requires energy to maintain itself as living tissue. So that's where the extra energy requirement comes in, is because you've got to maintain a larger biomass per hectare, and that has a background energy requirement just to keep that live tissue, but not so much in as far as hydraulics is concerned. Yeah.
Because the hydraulics, it's all passive, right?
Yep, it's a passive system. Most of it's passive. Yeah.
But if you have a bigger tree, you also have a bigger root system.
You do have a bigger root system. The question, if you have got a bigger tree, you've got a bigger root system. You definitely have a bigger root system, but then you also, again, if they're exposed to the same amount of water conditions, it's also a bigger root system to dry out a lot quicker. So a much bigger volume to dry out quicker, except if it's tapping then into deeper water somewhere else. Okay. But if they've got exactly the same amount of water, a big tree will be less efficient than a small tree. No, there's no reason why it can't grow bigger. The problem is a tree will always try and balance the root to shoot ratio. That's why bigger trees most of the time have bigger roots, because they have to maintain a balance between the roots and the shoots.
What will be the situation when we keep clipping the trees from the top and the roots are still growing up?
Dan, you want to answer that one though? Dan was drawing some nice pictures in terms of, if you keep on snipping it, it depends on where you're snipping it. That's the big one. If you're snipping and you want to go?
No, you're right.
No, if you're snipping it and it's stimulating more and more vegetative growth, it's just continuously causing an imbalance. So there's just more of a fight. It just depends on where you're snipping it in that tree when you're making that reduction in canopy size. Want to chip in on that? So if you do hedging, you're causing 1 million of new growth points, and it's a big energy requirement, and that excess amount of tree you're growing on the outside will have to cause an excess amount of roots being developed there as well. But if you go and do limb removal and you just get one big, it's not going to have such a big impact on the roots because you're not getting that massive amount of regrowth coming from a single limb. So it depends on where you're cutting it though. Any other questions? Good. Alrighty. So we've gone through that. We've seen what happens, and this is what we've seen in macadamias happening now. So we're pretty familiar with vapor pressure deficit now. Everybody's happy with that concept, how thirsty the environment is. And we can see this is what happens. So if we measure how open or closed the stomata is, they're at their most open situation during that VPD of 1 to about 2.5. In that scenario there, they'll be the most open, so they'll be losing the most amount of water. And remember that water, for every droplet of water you're losing, you're getting some carbon dioxide into the system. And if you're getting carbon dioxide, you're making more food, and more food is more yield most of the time, or more growth. Okay. So macadamias are sitting in that range, and as soon as the demand goes in, the demand increases, then the stomata start shutting. So those valves say, whoa, we're losing way too much water. Just give it a second, we're going to start closing a little bit. Okay. And the same, we see that with transpiration. So the amount of millimeters the tree will lose, you'll see it go up, and then it flattens out. So to a certain point, there's only X amount of water that could be lost. There's a maximum amount of water that could be lost by a tree on every single day. It's not an infinite amount. The tree can't just continue losing water. So what it basically tells you, even if it's super dry today and super warm today, you putting on 300 liters, the tree's not going to use the 300 liters. It's got a maximum that can go through these straws in every single day. It can only use a certain amount. Okay? It can't use more than that. If you're giving it 300, it's not going to use 300. It'll only use the amount that can push through these little straws. So just looking at how stomata then open during the day, that's 6 o'clock in the morning. In the morning, that first response, that linear response that you're getting there is because there's sunlight coming into the orchard. Okay, so the trees need sun to start working. Okay, and if the sun comes in, the stomata will open. Then the sun is at 8 o'clock in that orchard, the sun's up there, and then what happens is the tree will run until the vapor pressure deficit becomes too high. So it becomes too warm, too dry for the environment, and then the tree will say, I need to shut the valves a little bit. I'm losing water too quickly out of the system. It's not safe for operation, and it takes a little bit of an afternoon nap. So it goes down until it goes to about 1 o'clock. It will maybe start picking up if the conditions are a little bit more favorable for water loss.
Can I ask Dan a question?
Yeah, you can ask Dan a question.
Dan, is this the general trend for all varieties?
I'd imagine it would be slightly different, but I think again in different varieties in different regions. But generally, the macadamia doesn't seem to like the high VPD. So during the day, the VPD will start low, and especially if you've got dew of a morning, it'll start at 0. And then during the day, as the sun comes up, the VPD, vapor pressure deficit will increase, and then towards the night, it'll go back down towards 0, towards pre-dawn. And a lot of the time, the sap flow or the stomata will be open at full go in the morning when it's a low VPD and going up, but as it goes up, and if there's especially if there's limited water in the soil, it will be losing, it somehow senses it's going to be losing a lot more water and using that a lot less efficiently at high evaporative demand, so it'll slow it down as stomatal aperture, and then as you see there at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, we might have another little go. And then, so by that stomatal aperture, again, we'll go into it later, and that stomatal control and stomatal closing is sensitive to soil moisture stress. So there's a bit of a balance between, if there's heaps of water always available, it might open for longer during the day, but very sensitive to VPD, and I think that'll be a general behaviour of these trees. It'll be different on a cloudy day. This looks like a sunny day.
So is there reasoning from the tree that it reasons at the beginning of the day for its daily water use, or is that a constant regulation?
Yeah, it's not. I don't think the tree has the ability to reason. It's it's just it's a physical response to the turgor in the leaf. So as the leaf is losing water very quickly in a high evaporative demand, slightly loses turgor or pressure in that leaf, and that pressure drop itself can be stomatal. Can inhibit stomatal opening and closing. And there's also very fine-tuned stomatal responses to hormonal signals of water stress coming from the root. So it's a combination of leaf turgor pressure responses and daily hormonal responses to soil moisture stress. Yeah, so we're finding the varietal differences are pretty stark sometimes. So, and the A38s, when there is a lot of water around, will go pretty hard all day, and that way, because they're maybe less responsive to that, if the water's there, they'll use it and make more sugar on a given day than another variety like an 816, which is much more sensitive to those, and it has a different control system, much more sensitive to the soil moisture stress signal. But then again, if you put an A38 into a dry environment, you might not get the kernel recovery in those dry years because it goes so hard and hasn't got that stomatal control. It burns itself out and runs out of sugar. So the difference in varietal differences in responses to that vapor pressure deficit and soil moisture and that stomatal aperture going longer during the day once we get a deeper understanding that, we can start to explain the differences in the performances of the varieties in different types of drought situations. And we have got a lot of sap flow meters going into A38s to answer some of the poor kernel quality issues in Bundaberg. Yeah, so I was saying there that if you've got a little bit of soil moisture stress, it'll create abscisic acid. We'll cover it off in more depth later, but you've got an abscisic acid signal coming from the roots in drying down soil profiles. So that if your soil is dry at 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock, and you decide you're going to water at 10, it won't even open up for the day, and 10 o'clock's too late, and we're already going to the high VPD parts of the day, so it won't open up. So just the timing, do you get that water on before the stomata start opening, so that when it does open, there's no restriction on that opening? Then if you water at 5:30, you'll get a production out of that day, but if you water at 10:30, 11 a.m, you're going to get much reduced production out of that day. The confounding factor with that is if you reduce transpiration by spraying 5 litres of kale and clay on your leaf, which doesn't, I've tried that, I've tried 4 or 5 and the respiration doesn't stop even 1%, but let's say it did, and we were reducing transpiration by 30% on any given day, then you got less water going up, exchanging carbon dioxide, then you've basically reduced your output. So yeah, it'd be lovely if there was just a magic chemical you could spray on, but there isn't, as far as I'm aware.
The question is stomata of macadamia is more efficient in controlling water loss than any other tree. There's some other pretty mean trees out there which are much more efficient than this, but I would say macadamias are pretty close to being very efficient at, they're pretty finely attuned to vapor pressure deficit, more so than a lot of the other factors. But it also there's a bunch of other factors why it's so efficient and why it needs to be efficient. But it is a little bit more efficient than citrus, definitely more efficient than citrus and avocado, if that's a good reference. All right, let's go through those ones. All right, so the question is, can we use can we use stems and leaves to indicate water stress? Huh? And we definitely can, okay? So one of the key things, that was one of the monitoring tools somebody was asking about. We'll address some of these questions as we go, but can you use a leaf? So a lot of the things we're pretty used to is you go on holiday, you went to Indonesia or somewhere very nice, Bali or some of those places, you come back home and that orchid of yours sitting in the kitchen windowsill's just gone completely wilted. It's just hanging there. And we as humans go, it needs some water. You go and give it water, about 2 days later or a day later, it's fully open again, looking healthy, no problem at all. The problem is you're not trying to produce 6 tons of orchid in a year. So, if you're running into a visual symptom of macadamia water stress, so you walking past your small little trees, or you're walking past a tree and the new flush is wilting, if you ran into that scenario where you've seen the new flush wilting, you won't see old flush wilting, it just doesn't happen. But if you see new flush wilting, then you've already incurred a cost to production. You're too late. There's already a limitation that you ran into. So it's like doing a post-mortem. It's not a good indication. It is an indication of water stress, but it's too late of an indication. And you should have actually never ran into into that trouble. The other thing is as well, you could have small little trees in the ground. Okay, they could have been watered yesterday, and you could still see some leaves being wilted. And there's too many other environmental variables which will influence that. If it's a windy day, they will wilt. This tomato will close on a windy day. So it's not necessarily always an indication of water stress. Environmental variables will also lead to wilting of plants. So a wilting leaf is not a good visual indication of water stress in any crop. Okay. So we can use measurements of leaf temperature as well to give us an indication of if a plant is stressed or not. And that basically comes down to if these valves close at the bottom of the leaf, it's not losing water anymore. And if it's not losing water, it's not cooling off the leaf or the plant anymore. That makes sense though? Okay, so if it's closed down, the plant will warm up, the leaves will be warmer than the air because they're just sitting there and they're dark green in color. And that leaf temperature will then be a good indication. So a lot of new technology has gone into that, into trying to fly drones with thermal imaging cameras over crops and giving an indication of leaf temperature, if the crops are stressed or not. Most of the time it's good. It's a little bit difficult on an on-farm scale to do that. And then the last one, which is still one of the most reliable methods to indicate plant water stress, is using a pressure bomb. And I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with it, but what that basically is, I'm going to try and explain it as easily as I can. Don't even worry about the stuff on the board. It's basically, if this tree has gone through, if there's enough water in the soil, okay, the tree or the plant will fill itself up with water because there's enough water. And if I go before the tree starts losing water, which is pre-dawn, when the sun is still down and the trees aren't working that hard, and I basically go and I squeeze that leaf, this is where the pressure comes in. If I only have to squeeze slightly on that leaf and water comes out, it's pretty much full of water. Okay? If I have to apply an excessive amount of water, it's not refilled completely, and therefore the tree's under stress or the plant is under stress. Makes sense. You get some of these pressure bombs, some of them are very nice ones. The almond industry relies on them heavily. You get some, they actually come with a little bicycle pump. So you plug the leaf in, so the leaf goes into the cap there, the petiole, which is, everybody knows what the petiole is. The petiole sticks through that little valve there at the top, and it's just got a normal bicycle pump next to it, and it could give you a good indication of whether the tree is stressed or not. Okay, this is the most reliable method used in science. And for macadamias, this number is about 0.7. I don't know if I've added it in there. But if you get a pre-dawn leaf water potential of 0.7 megapascals, the tree is stressed. Okay, and then you need to water again. Any questions before we go on? No.
Sorry, against the temperature of the leaf, can that be an indication of stress?
Yes, like we covered in the previous one, leaf temperature has got an effect. So if the stomata are closed, it's not cooling down the leaf anymore, and therefore leaf temperature will pick up. So leaf temperature is a good indication. Robbie?
You mentioned wind having an effect on the
Yeah.
wind with high humidity compared to with low humidity. Does it have a different effect?
No, wind is still a problem. So wind still will lead to stress and lead. The biggest issue with wind is the wind is taking away the moisture too quickly from the plant. High humidity, low humidity, it doesn't matter. The wind is just taking away that moisture. And when we get to how can we alleviate some of these things, I'll explain to you exactly what the effect of wind would be on some of these factors. Another question, Chris.
Leaf temperature relative to what?
That's usually relative to air temperature or relative to other unstressed tree temperature, which is where the problem comes in. Yeah, you actually, that's why most of those systems need a lot of calibration. So you first need to find an unstressed orchard and get that with pre-dawn leaf water potential. If you know it's not stressed and you can get a temperature, then you know what it would be on a stressed tree. So it's relative to either unstressed trees or to air temperature. Yep. It is accurate. If you get some of those FLIR cameras that the electricians use, they're pretty good. Hey? They give you infrared thermometer reading, and you can see distinct differences between the trees. Okay.
Can we buy those?
Oh yeah, there's the companies. There might be a lot of them. The ones I used to work with is called PMS Instruments, Pressure Measurement Systems. They're from the US, and you get some very nice handheld ones. It's basically we've got one in the back of the ute, and it just plugs out. It's got a little foot pump, and you pump it, and you can see what the pressure is. And it's a nice little system. I think the almond. So some of the almond growers in America. They've got companies coming out and measuring this now for them. So it's a service provided by external companies coming and measuring these things for them. I think, Dan, you've got some psychrometers as well. They're a little bit tricky, but if you've got someone like Dan that understands them, a psychrometer, which is more or less going to give you exactly the same reading. And you can just install them and they upload to an app, to your computer. Dan could maybe link you up with some automated ones, which are nice. You don't have to go out in the field. I like going out in the field though. Any questions before we go on from there? Okay, I'll finish off with this one. Is that fine? Okay. Then the last one, which is actually rather scary, is the root component. So the root component of trees is the component we base everything we do on. Everything. If it's fertilizer or irrigation, we base it on the root component. And the scariest part about the root component is it's the thing we know the least amount about. Okay. Straight through all research, roots aren't studied. Scientists don't like getting dirty, and we don't like digging in the ground. So we know nothing about it, and for the next 30 to 40 years, I still think we're going to know very little about it. So nevertheless, water usually moves from the roots or from the soils into the roots. Okay, and we'll cover that now. So it's the same as osmosis, though. Okay, so with osmosis, something moves from a high concentration to a low concentration, and this is the same. We refer to potential. That doesn't matter. But if the soil is wet, water will move from a wet soil to a dry root. Okay, the roots aren't completely dry. It's relatively dry. So from wet soil to a dry root. And we can read through all of this, but it doesn't matter. The key thing is all irrigation scheduling tools, every single tool that focuses on soil water content, so measures soil moisture, is based on this principle, that water will not move from a dry soil to a dry root. It has to move from wet soil to a dry root. Okay, everybody's comfortable with this. So basically, Don't worry about the numbers. I'm going to sit down again. Don't worry about the numbers on the side there. But basically, the soil is wetter. The number is bigger there. -3 is bigger than -5. So the soil is wetter. It moves from the soil to the roots, from the roots into the xylem, and then from the xylem into the leaf. And the atmosphere is the biggest sucking power here. So it's negative because it's sucking. It's not a positive pressure. Otherwise, it would be pumping. So it's negative because it's sucking the stuff out. And then into the atmosphere. And this is how the plant would lose water. So we've covered all these components. Everybody happy with this? This is how plants, it's a sucking process out of the soil, and it's passive. So what happens if the soil is more negative, it's drier than what the roots are? Will water move in? No, we know that. We know that as farmers, if the soil is dry, the tree can't take up water because there is no water to take up. And basically, how does the tree know this? I mean, how do leaves know that the soil is dry? Pressure? Yeah, definitely. There's a pressure difference, and that's why they will shut down. Like Dan said, if the pressure in the leaf drops, those valves will shut at the top as well. There's a physical change. But the biggest change of that is through chemical signaling. And that is hormonal signaling of ABA. So ABA is abscisic acid. So the soil dries out. The roots sense that the soil is dried out. And all of a sudden what happens? I'm sending a message to the leaf. You guys just stop working. Stop losing water. It's not good. It's not good down here. Right. It's like workers sending to top management to change something. We need to stop. Right. And that's what happens. It goes up. ABA moves up in the tree into the leaves. And that hormone is then telling the leaves to shut down. Stop working, please. Shut the valves. We can't lose water.
Sorry, Theunis.
Yeah.
Does it move as fast as your?
Oh no, definitely not. It could move as fast. So it depends on where it's coming from. But there could also be a significant time lag between when the root senses it and when it gets to the leaf. Right, and then the leaf runs into a bit of trouble sometimes. But it could take 30 seconds to 3 days for that signal to get to the leaves. Any other questions before we go on to the next slide? Okay, so this is basically what stomata look like. We've looked at it. So in there's a lot of water. So those are the two valves. They're water valves. Sorry, I'm going to sit down again. These two little water valves, and they're full of pressure now. But when the hormone hits that leaf, okay, that hormone tells those little valves, get rid of the water. Okay, relieve some pressure. Don't be at full pressure. Don't be fully open. And what happens then is it goes, all the water, all those little red dots, the water's coming out there. And all the water that's come out causes those little valves to go, I'm going to shut. They never completely shut. Okay, they try, but they can't completely shut. It's just not as effective as a normal valve, but they will shut down a lot. And when that happens, it means no carbon dioxide can move through that valve, no water can go out, and no carbon dioxide can go in. And if carbon dioxide doesn't go in, the tree can't photosynthesize, and then there goes your yield. All right. Happy still with this? All righty. So maybe another 3 hours from me. The first 3 was all right. So the first thing I think that's one of the key things it's coming across on the board as well, and the questions it's come across is, what is water stress? Are there different types of water stress? How do you manage the different types of water stress that we can get? Okay, so we'll go into a little bit of detail with that. Everybody still happy with what we discussed in the previous little session there? Okay, good stuff. So traditionally, when I ask you something about water stress, you'll tell me that I don't have water in the soil and therefore the crop is stressed. That's pretty basic. We all know that we are in a farming system. We know that is the scenario. But can a crop be water stressed even if there's water in the soil? Yes, it can. Okay, so there's different types of stress, and we need to try and understand that. One of them is atmospheric water deficit or atmospheric drought, and the other one is physiological drought. And the one thing we need to try and remember is that we can control some of these factors, but we can't control all of them. And this is something we just need to realize. Okay. So which one can we control and which ones can't we? Let's look at some of them. So we know now what VPD is. Okay. We know what vapor pressure deficit is. And the key thing here is that everybody needs to remember is that VPD is an atmospheric component. Okay. And for us to change the atmosphere, you'll really have to be pretty good, and it doesn't happen in a field situation. So basically what happens, at high VPDs, so if the atmosphere is becoming increasingly dry over the season, okay, you can have a little bucket full of water, or soil can be completely full of water, but if it's too dry and too hot on the outside, you are not going to get a good crop because the tree is atmospherically stressed. Okay, so there's stresses in the atmosphere which the tree don't like. All right, and we'll have a look at it. And this was one of the biggest things. Old literature and some of the older people in the industry would have told you, do not plant at above 750 meters above sea level. Well, I mean, there's no logical explanation why height above sea level has anything to do with something. The only logical explanation's got to do with it is the more you go inland, the higher you go up, the more extreme weather variables become. Okay? And therefore, when you go inland all the time, you get these massive upswings between getting 5 degrees Celsius in the morning temperature, but the maximum is 45 degrees Celsius. And the air becomes drier the more you go inland. We all know that. So when you get closer to the coast, that vapor pressure deficit is mediated by the ocean. So the ocean's bringing in a lot of moist air into that system. It's not getting too hot. Maximum or minimum temperature for the day is maybe 16 or 17 degrees Celsius, and the maximum maybe 30, 32 degrees Celsius on an average day. So there's not this big gap between minimums and maximums, and you don't get the extremes. But when you go inland or to these high vapor pressure deficit environments, the trees don't perform well because it's atmospherically dry. So even if you've got water at the bottom, they won't do well under high vapor pressure deficit environments. Makes sense, okay? So how can we alleviate atmospheric water stress? We can try and increase humidity. This can be done, but it's extremely expensive, okay? So one of the things you can do, you can water larger areas on higher clay soils. So if you've got some of these red dirt soils with high clay content, you throw your water out because you've got a lot of water. You throw all this water out over that area, and that water will evaporate from that clay and cause a change in humidity. Okay, it's like having a wet towel across the orchard. It'll just continue losing water, and it create the entire environment to become more humid, and it will decrease vapor pressure deficit. It will enrich the environment with water, and the trees will actually perform better. The other thing is that you can do, Dan will also talk about this a little bit, is overhead watering. Okay, and this is some trials that are continuously going on now. People are putting misters up in trees to just try and get the humidity up. If you can get the humidity up, even at the same temperatures or high temperatures, the vapor pressure deficit will be lower, and therefore the trees will be less stressed if you can get some water up in the tree, because it's that environment around the tree that is too dry and causing it to stress. Or, yes.
But to what degree can we change that?
With overhead watering, it just depends. So let's do the first one with larger areas, or wetting larger areas, or wetting areas. You'll have to continuously do that, and it will most likely change vapor pressure deficit by about 0.1 to 0.2 kilopascal. So it's not a big change in that. With the overhead watering, I think you can go down quite a lot, but it's continuous. So just doing one overhead watering or just running your sprayer up and down the row might change the vapor pressure deficit for about 15 minutes if you're lucky, and it will change it maybe by 1 kilopascal or something like that. So there will be an instantaneous thing, but you'll have to continuously do that. So if you've got a tractor running up and down all the time, it might work, but overhead misting is a better option at around a 15-minute intervals there. Yes?
Can you comment on humidity during flowering for macadamia?
Oh yeah, definitely. Look, we did overhead watering using floppy sprinklers in South Africa, running a trial to see if we can alleviate water stress. Well, the first season was pretty much horrible because we never thought further than that. But if you've got humidity during flowering, high humidity, so you're trying to alleviate that stress. If you've got that humidity, high humidity, you've got the issue with all the flower diseases, which you don't want. That's a nightmare. But there is a fine balance. If you've got low humidity, so extremely dry conditions during flowering, that's pretty much a nightmare. The flowers dry out pretty quickly. So with flowers, you basically want to sit around between 50 and 60% humidity. That's a good system to be sitting in. If you go higher than that, it's just pathogen nightmare. Go lower than that, then you just got drying out of flowers, and it's physical desiccation of flowers. So flowers don't have stomata on them. They can't lose water through flowers, and that cooling is highly then environmentally dependent. Answer the question. Yes.
In case you have plenty of water and the roots down, but still low humidity outside, is that going to be helpful?
No, if you've got a lot of water in the soil and the humidity is low on the outside, the tree is atmospherically stressed. So you could have 1,000 liters to your disposal every single day and give that to the tree. If it's dry on the outside and the vapor pressure deficit is high, it's not going to help him through that system. He's finely attuned to what's happening on the outside. Leonie. All right, so the question is, in the South African context, 2015, the drought hit South Africa, so it was a bad year. The one key thing is we never ran out of water. So you can go and ask any South African farmer in a macadamia producing area, did you run out of water? Definitely not. Okay, some of those water or those irrigation systems, I was in charge of scheduling them almost perfectly, and we still had a bad crop. So it didn't matter. We had all the water in the world that we could have to our disposal, and we still had a very bad crop on those farms. And it's just because of the fact that even if the tree's happy on the root system, if it's running dry and warm on the outside, it is actually just horrible for the crop. He doesn't like it. Okay, and I'll show you, we can discuss the shade netting part of things now and how that changes it, but I want to just get to this picture, and I'll sit down again so that everyone can see. But this picture basically shows that as vapor pressure in a drought condition, vapor pressure deficit increases because the atmosphere is dry. There's no clouds, so it's not raining. There's no moisture in the air, and then vapor pressure deficit increases. The amount of water that's being lost from the soil increases. There's decreased amounts of rain. The land becomes drier and drier, and it's just this vicious cycle. So everybody always tells you, we can irrigate our lawn. It's just never as good as when it rains. The rain changes our lawn's color and everything, because with the rain comes an increased amount of moisture in the air. It's a lot better growing environment for all crops. So it's not necessarily the amount of rain even that you're getting, it's about the environmental conditions that come along with that rain. And that's what we've been seeing. Everybody's been asking how things going in South Africa. Are we getting some rain? We got 5 mils just before flowering. So 5 millimeters for me in the flowering time, although it maybe brings a little bit of pathogen risk and all the rest of the stuff, but it's so good because we've got humidity coming in. 5 millimeters of rain is not wetting soil or cancelling out irrigation, but it means the environment is there's a lot of moisture in the air, and if there's moisture in the air, you can grow a good crop. If there's not moisture in the air, you'll have a very bad crop. Right. Okay, so one of the other things we can do is shade netting. And everybody's going to ask me, so what does shade netting do? So I'm going to try and explain it in the best way I can possibly that I can. So when the leaf is sitting outside in the field, there's a lot of factors playing a role in how it loses and how it senses how dry or wet it is outside. So if it's sitting outside, Robbie's question previously was, what's the effect of wind? Okay, so imagine now, I told you the previous time, scientists are usually pretty much on something, so they've got wild imaginations. But just around this little leaf, there's a thin layer of moisture, all right? Just below it. Around the stomata, around those valves, is a thin layer of moisture, which we refer to as boundary layer. It's a boundary layer moisture that's there. I like to refer to it as the therapy dog, all right? This is the therapy dog of the plant, okay? So this little boundary layer that's there, if the wind comes and the wind is blowing, it strips away the boundary layer, okay? So there's no therapy dog. The plant or those valves don't have a therapy dog there telling him it's going to be all right, we're going to get through this. It doesn't happen. So it's directly exposed to the environment. Everything this leaf then sees without its therapy dog is just bad. It's seeing exactly what's going on in the environment. And that's what wind does. Wind takes away your therapy dog on the leaf. The different thing is now, if you put this leaf under shade netting, you eliminate wind. It's not about getting shade into the orchard. It's about eliminating wind. Okay, so if you put up shade netting, it eliminates the wind component from the orchard. And all of a sudden, you've got this boundary layer there. The therapy dog's there. So what the valve is seeing, or what the leaf is seeing to the outside, is not as extreme anymore. It's a little bit of buffering capacity in there. So basically, that therapy dog is telling the leaves, all right, the humidity is dropping below 40, but don't worry, I'm here with you. You'll be all right. You can still lose a little bit of water. You can go on producing. Everything would be fine. Okay, does that make sense? So that being said, which ones lose more water? Citrus under a shade netted environment, or citrus planted out in the field? Which one loses the most water or uses the most water? Rough guess. Exactly. So what you're doing, I'm not going to go all the way back, but you remember when we looked at what's happening in that daily situation, the tree is shutting down at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock. So if you can take that edge off and you just push it for 2 to 3 hours longer every day, which is happening under these shade netting conditions, okay? The therapy dog is just pushing it a little bit further. It helps it go along, get through these tough times, okay? You've got 2 or 3 hours of more transpiration and 3 or 4 hours of more sugar being produced during photosynthesis, okay? So a shade netted citrus will use a lot more water than citrus planted outside in the field. And it's across a lot of crops. Avocado is exactly the same thing. But then citrus, if you're going to look at the production, a shade netted citrus production, most likely hovering in South Africa, hovering around 110 to 120 tons per hectare under shade netting, whereas out in the field, they're most likely getting 80 to 85 tons a hectare. Okay, so they're willing to pay that little bit more water because they're getting more production out of it. Okay, so don't be afraid of losing water out of the leaf. The more water you can lose out of the leaf, the more energy you're producing. And that's why shade netting can work. Question? Yeah, the shade effect of the net will, the question is, what is the shade effect of the net? The shading will have a little bit of an influence. Most of your shade netted houses or netting houses have about 10%, 15% shade to them. It's really not to get the shade into the system. The little bit of shade will cause a slight reduction in leaf temperature. And because the leaves are a little bit cooler, the vapor pressure deficit is also more favorable around the leaf than in the outside environment.
So that potentially opens the question up for windbreaks. Okay, the question is, it opens up the question, do you put windbreaks in there or not? The thing with windbreaks is,
it might stop 3 to 4 rows into the. Yeah, it's turbulent, but it's still just not eliminating the wind completely. And you actually want what we call fetch. It's a term used in science where it's actually wind displacement over an area. So because it's running over an extended area under shade netting, it's running on top of that shade net house, it actually dissipates the bigger that is. So there's a lot of factors. You can't have a shade netting house that's smaller than 4 hectares. So if the block is smaller than 4 hectares, it's not going to work, because you need that extended length of the wind blowing across it, and that will actually get the wind out of it. If you're getting wind breaks, even if the trees are tall, they'll just die if the wind just goes over, and about, 16, depending on the height of your windbreak, but let's say it's an 8 meter tall windbreak, about 16 meters in, the wind's there again. It's a lot less, but it's still there, so it's breaking wind, it's not eliminating wind. All right. Perfect. We've gone through that one. The other one is physiological water stress. So physiological water stress it's a term that I've put in here. It's pretty common, but we know now that water moves from a wet soil, into a dry root, but that's not always the case. If you've got salty water on the outside, the water won't move into the tree. That's based on osmosis, so water won't go in there. And it's exactly the same as you being stranded on a boat in the ocean and drinking salt water. The more salt water you drink, the more thirsty you become. And this is exactly what happens to plants. So if you've got salty water and there's an influx of salty water into the orchard, you can get to a physiological drought. So even if you give more water, it's still a lot of salts in that water, and the tree will not like it. No plant will like it. Certain plants are better at taking up salts than others, and there's a whole range of salt tolerance. But if you've got salt water, you're better off not irrigating in a drought condition than irrigating with that salt water. You're making it even worse. There's also some ways you can get around it. You need to do a lot of gypsum applications to wash out some of those salts. We've spoken about this in the orchard yesterday as well. Mulching also helps. So if you've got a micro sprinkler system, throwing that salty water over the mulch, the salts usually stay a little bit on the mulch. It's a little bit difficult in Australia because of labour, but I'm sure you can get around it. We do it in some of our sugarcane producing areas. Once the water quality goes down, we put a lot of the sugarcane tops over the ridges or over the fields. The salty water settles on the sugarcane tops. The good water filters through, or a less concentrated amount of salt filters through those mulch, and then before the rainy season starts, we just start taking out the mulch. If there's a method or a sweeper or something that can do it, but just then start taking out the mulch and then removing it from the orchard in some way or another, or getting it to the middle of the row, putting a lot of gypsum over it, and then as soon as the rain comes, it will wash out those salts in the soil. And when you do that, you need to take care of you need to take care of how you manage water. I'll get to this a little bit later when we look at some of the tools. Okay, and this is the easiest one. Any questions on that previous one? Okay, good. So the next one is soil water stress. We all pretty much know what soil water stress is. And there's an easy way of solving soil water stress. You just open the tap. So if there's a tap, if you've got one, it's pretty easy. You open the tap, you give water, and the plant's not in stress anymore. The real question you need to be asking yourself, when and how much water should we apply? What if I only have a limited amount of water? And it's all linked to what we had on the board there, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. And will my trees benefit if I apply irrigation? It's all those types of questions you need to be running through your mind then when trying to alleviate the stress. Okay, so the first thing we need to try and determine is when. When do I irrigate my plants? This is when during a cycle do I give my plants water. Not during the time of the day, I think we've covered now. Dan has alluded to it. He'll show you some of his research as well. You want to give it when the plant needs it, which is at the start of the day. You don't want to give that water in the middle of the day, but there's some practical limitations to this always. Okay. So there's two methods you can use. You can use tension meters, which are pretty common, and we've got a lot of them in the world, or you can use capacitance probes. Okay. So tension meters, they physically tell you how strongly water is held by the soil. That's physically what they're telling you. What is the pressure? What's the tension? Is it pulling? How hard is that soil pulling on that water? And I'll show this to you with some props now. Okay. They're very soil specific. They're cheap and easy to use. And the newer versions are very nice. I mean, the G-dots are tensiometers. There's a lot of them. There's chameleon probes. I haven't spoken about them too much. The chameleon probes are produced here in Australia. Leonie, I'm asking you every time. Is it $220 for them?
Yeah, that's for the basic starter pack.
Yep. So a starter pack's about $220 for the chameleon probes. And they usually have 3 sensors. You can put them at different depths. Okay? They're going to give you a color: green, blue, or red. Blue is happy, blue is too wet, green is happy, red is dry. Okay? That's basically the amount of information that you need. And it's the same with these G-dots. They're telling you in which part of the soil is it wet or dry. And they tension meters. They give you an indication of how tightly water is held by the soil. Or the old trusty friend, which is just a normal tensiometer, which has been around longer than I have been around. Okay, so what are they telling us? And we'll spend a few seconds on this, and I'll just try and explain some of these concepts to you. I've got 2 sponges in front, different. This one's very coarse textured. We'll say this is a sand. And this one is a loam. It's finer textured. It's got a lot more spaces. So this is loam, and the green one would be sand. And what I want to try and show to you is the different water holding capacities of these different soils, which I'm pretty sure you know already. But if I'm pushing the green one in here now, okay, I'm going to take it out. And what you first see, as soon as I take it out, the water just runs through it. It runs through it pretty quickly though, hey? And it'll run, it's done. I'm going to shake it a little bit there. And it's pretty much dry. Okay, so it was a quick action. It was fairly quick. At the sponge dry, I can squeeze a little bit. There might be something coming out. There's not a lot. Okay, this is sand. And when you look at what a tensiometer is going to tell you, from wetting, which is more or less there at field capacity, that's when most of the drainage water is gone. The water's drained through. This is field capacity. It's damp. It's not wet, but there's still some moisture in here. Okay, from here to dry, it's going to be that little piece there. So we're at field capacity. Okay, and when you get to that 30 mark on a tensiometer, there's actually no more water really left. It's not readily available to the plant. The plant will struggle to get more water out of it. And how I'd like to explain it is if I go, the harder I have to push to put water out of the sponge. So I have to press it. Do you see there's some water coming out there? This is the amount of strength or energy, not really energy, but the pulling power the plant needs to put in to get that water out. And if it has to put in a lot of pulling power, it's becoming less and less efficient. Makes sense, right? Okay. What happens if we get the loamy one in here? You put the loam one in there. Okay. It sucks up water pretty quickly. Okay. See, that's a lot slower. The water is dripping out a lot slower than in the sand. And this will continue to drip for quite a while. Okay, so I'm going to speed up the process a little bit. I'm going to squeeze it slightly, just to prove the point here. And it's a wet sponge. Okay? And this wet sponge is now at field capacity. So there's a lot more water at field capacity. Okay? It's the maximum amount of water the soil or the sponge can hold after most of the drainage has taken place. And now I'm starting to squeeze it. You see I only have to squeeze lightly at the start. And squeeze, water will come out. A lot more water is coming out than with a green sponge. And then squeeze. I don't want to make a mess. Squeeze. At a certain point, I can even pass it around, but at a certain point, there's still some water in this, okay? If I press it, some water is going to come out still, but now it's getting to the upper limit of what the plant can actually achieve, okay? So he doesn't want to put a lot more energy into taking out this water here. And you've seen it took me a lot longer to get the water out of this sponge than to get the water out of this sponge. This one depleted pretty quickly, this one a lot longer. All right, and there's still some water in here. And that's what tensiometers tell you. They basically tell you, am I going quickly? You see the range from field capacity to the refill point there, that line there for sand, is pretty quick. It goes like this. You have to refill sand, okay? And you have to do that on a regular basis. Where if we get to loam, let's say loam is at that red line there, there's a big gap. The trees can run a little bit longer with that water, the same amount of water, they can run a little bit longer on a better soil. We're all used to this though. Eh? This is what tensiometers tell you. They tell you what the suction power of the soil is for that water. Makes sense, right? Any questions before we go on? Okay. And then the other tool we can use is capacity. Yeah?
I do have a question. The tensiometers, do you have to maintain them?
Yes. So if you've got tensiometers, they're cheap and easy tools, but those ones you most likely would need to replace every 3 years is what you need them to replace. The G-dots, also more or less 3 years, but the tensiometer, those ones you have to take out every year. You can the top screws off and you have to resend it for calibration every single year. Okay. All right. So the other one is capacitance probes. There's a lot of jibber jabber here. I'm not going to go into that. Okay. And there's a little booklet in front of you, which I've put a lot of time in explaining soil texture and structure and how you can determine it, and the tools available to growers and all the rest of the stuff. So this will be in there. But basically it's a little bit more expensive, quite a lot more expensive most of the time. And it's a relative measure of water content. It shows you trends in water. It does not sense water directly in the soil. It just tells you the soil is busy drying out or the soil is busy wetting up. That's just what it's telling you. And it collects high resolution data. So it's collecting on an hourly basis or half hourly basis and putting those graphs in there for you. Okay? But it requires some knowledge of the crop and of the soil. You need a lot of information to make a good decision with that. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, this is more or less how it looks like. So this is macadamias in a sandy soil. There's 10 centimeters, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 centimeters. That's how there's sensors everywhere along that probe, and it's picking up how water is moving through that specific soil profile. All right. Then what we do is we'll say the top part there is where most of the water is being used. I've gone into the field, I've dug a trench, and I see, all right, my root zone is mostly in the top 300 centimeters of the soil. So a lot of these graphs then get combined to give you a weighted average of what's happening. Am I losing anyone? Still going well? And then what you still get, this is just me with my artistic skills to try and explain to you how these things work then. Okay. So that little spike there is an irrigation or a rainfall event. Okay. The probes go up. It tells you there's an influx of water. Water's coming into the profile. Now it goes up and then you see it goes down straight. So it just goes took. And what happens there is when we get from the point, that straight down is that point where water is just freely moving out of the soil. It's free drainage. The plant can't use water that quickly. It's just water running through the soil. Okay. Once that water's moved through the soil, you see it makes a little bit of a half pipe there. There just starts to flatten out. That's field capacity, more or less. That's where that's the upper maximum of what the moisture that specific soil can hold. Okay, and then what happens? You start seeing it goes drinking. It goes down during the day, flatter during the night. Down during the day, flat during the night. It goes all the way down until you get to a point where there's actually no water being used anymore, And that water, because there's no water movement anymore, that's a good indication. It's a relative measure that we've run out of water. The tree can't drink water anymore. If you'll dig a hole there, there'll still be some moisture in the soil, but it's too difficult for the plant to start taking up that moisture. It's not readily available anymore. And then after you've set up the field capacity and the refill point, you want to start refilling once the graph hits that point. You basically just play ping pong between the two lines. You just need to try and keep it boop, 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 like that, all right? That's what you're trying to achieve. And if you do that, you should not be running out of water most of the time. Does it make sense? Any questions on this? Okay, that's going well though. I'm almost done. So the last one, I think it's all close to the last one. The other thing is determining how much water, and this is where we get that evapotranspiration component coming in. Okay, in the olden days, it was referred to as pan evaporation. Remember that? I think some of the older people might remember pan evaporation. But basically what it's telling you is we're saying what's the maximum amount of water that could be lost on a specific day, and we multiply that with a crop factor. Okay, because that crop factor then says, no, but it's not a grass. That one, the ET0, the potential evapotranspiration, was calculated for grass. But we're not grass farmers. Well, not all of us are, some are, but we're not grass farmers, okay? And because we're not grass farmers, we have to get a factor in there to account for the fact that we're not grass farmers. We are tree farmers, okay? And it's specific to a crop, specific to macadamias, specific to citrus and avos. They all have different crop factors. And that crop factor is that KC value there. So let's say, and I'm going to show you now, and this is, just remember, this is determining how much water, more or less. You'll get that from your probes as well. You'll quickly learn that. But basically what it says, and these are made up numbers though. So we're saying the ET0, the potential amount of water that could be lost on Monday is 5, and Tuesday 2, and Wednesday 3, 4, and so we can go on and on and on and on and on with the same thing. Okay. At the end of the week, we see the environment wanted 23 millimeters of water that you would have taken 23 more or less. But we're farming with macadamias, and the crop factor for macadamias is 0.65, for big trees is 0.65. So macadamia trees are only using 65% of that water. Does that make sense? So when we go, we say ET0 times with the crop factor, 65%, and we are getting 15 millimeters of water, which would have been lost in that week. So for you to go back to your field, you at least need to replace 15 millimeters in that coming week. Leonie.
Does the crop factor change for seasons or phenological cycles?
Just want to have some tea first.
Okay.
This is a very crude approach of doing things. You're 100%. The crop factor does change for seasons, not seasons necessarily. It changes for phenological periods, and it changes for canopy size. So it would be a good indication for you. I won't use this necessarily to accurately schedule irrigation. Okay? It's a good idea for you to go and determine how much water am I in that ballpark. But you know, a smaller canopy will have a much smaller crop factor. A larger canopy will have a larger crop factor. During certain stages, that factor will be higher, like during fruit set and so forth. That would be higher, but during winter, that number will be lower. So using a straight factor is not a great idea, but it is a good tool to have in your back pocket if you want to start checking a few things in the orchard. So the big thing is, how do I effectively manage water in macadamias? It's a quick recap. So let's look at that first. Dan has covered a lot of information, but basically what we know is the atmosphere is the main driving factor of water use. We're aware of that now. We also know that macadamias are especially sensitive to increases in vapor pressure deficit, so they don't like dry environments, basically. And we also know that stomata can close due to a range of factors, of which drought is only one. And we know there's different types of drought then. We know there's saltwater drought, there's atmospheric moisture drought or atmospheric drought, and then there's physiological drought. And all those factors could lead to stomatal closure and a reduction in yield. So we can limit some of them. Some of these factors we can limit, and we've gone through how we can limit some of these factors, but we can't limit or eliminate all of those factors. We can do certain ones, but not all of them. And we have a range of tools to help us to measure and manage soil water effectively. And we can also get a rough idea about how much water macadamia trees are using. Dan's also gone into that, and I'm pretty sure some of you have a good idea. But basically, what I'd like to try and get to is, what do we need before we can make informed decisions? And this is about a checklist you want to have on your farm, more or less. So firstly, you need to go and try and find out what type of soil do you have. Do you have sandy soils, salty soils, clay soils? How deep are your soils? All those types of things. And I've been saying this across most of these courses. Before you even start planning an orchard, before you even plant a tree in the ground, know what type of soil you're dealing with. Dig a few profile pits, get a soil classification. Nutrients, most of the time we can actually change nutrients pretty quickly. Changing the soil texture and structure is not something you can do. So make sure you do your homework beforehand and get a good idea of what type of soil you're dealing with. The next thing, what you'll actually get from what type of soil you have, is know what the infiltration rate of the soil is. So high clay soils, smaller particles, lower infiltration rates. Coarser textured soils, higher infiltration rates. So you need to understand what those texture values mean to you. And once you know what type of soil, you know what the infiltration rate is, and then once you know what the infiltration rate is, you can go and decide what type of irrigation system you want to put on those soils. All right, and it will depend on a lot of factors. But for instance, it might be better if you've got a very sandy soil to go and put a dripper system on there if you've got a limited amount of water. If you've got infinite amount of water, it doesn't matter which system you're putting on there. But it depends on a whole bunch of factors, but you need to take all of this into account in combination with the type of soil you have before you start even thinking about putting an irrigation system into the soil. The other thing is, do you even have an irrigation system? That's another whole different question, which we've covered now, I think quite extensively, how we can go through not having it and so forth. Okay, emitter rate we've covered. And what is the rooting depth of your trees? So not everybody's got small trees in the ground. Some of us have got a lot bigger trees in the ground. And if you've got bigger trees in the ground, a big question is, where's the trees getting its water from, and where's it getting its nutrients from? Okay. So we do chemical analysis most of the time for nutrients only in that top 15 centimeters, more or less. But then the roots are sitting way down at 30, 40 centimeters in the soil. Same as water applications. It might be that on a good red soil, those roots are all the way down to 500, 600, and you're only irrigating in the top 300. So one of the things you could do on your farm, dig a trench, in your orchard, dig a trench, have a look through and see if there are where the roots are sitting. Get a good indication of what the rooting depth is. All right. You also need to know more or less what the weather is at your site. So installing even a small weather station, something that can give you some temperature and humidity. You can use that nice chart that you got just to give you an indication of what vapor pressure deficit is in your orchard, just by knowing what temperature and humidity is on a daily basis. It's also just good agricultural practice to have a weather station on your farm. It gives you a lot of information about spraying conditions and a whole bunch of other factors which you might need. And then, do you have some long-term weather data for for the site that you're working on? And that's pretty critical. Although, we've got climate change and all the rest of the factors running through, and those long-term values might not hold at this stage. But if you are prone to getting a lot of rain in December, you should actually know that. When you're trying to get into long-term weather data, it could help you plan your irrigation system and water requirements of the trees. But very few people do know that, and I think there's quite a lot of weather stations available in each of the areas in Australia to get some of that information from. All right, so now the big thing is, if I needed to manage my water on my macadamia farm, this is my own farm then, how would I do it? Because that still remains a big question. Okay, so firstly what I'll do, as I said, I'll determine what type of soil I have. Okay, so my farm, I didn't go and buy a bad farm. I bought one of the best farms. It's got a deep red loam soil. Okay, and I know for a deep red loam soil, the infiltration rate of that soil, and you'll see in that booklet in front of you, there's infiltration rates for a whole bunch of different textured soils, which I've put in there. But my soil has an infiltration rate of 15 millimeters per hour. All right. The next thing is, I'll fit a micro sprinkler system to my farm, because I like micros. I like seeing the water spray. I think it's easy to manage, and if you do it properly, it works well. And I'll have a spreading radius of 2 meters, and it will deliver 20 liters per hour. Okay. But the biggest issue here is, it's something I always tell everybody, is that if I get onto a farm and I ask a farmer, how much water are you giving? He's like, no, I'm giving 100 liters of water. Over what area are you giving that 100 liters of water? Over 10 square meters or over 1 square meter? Because it's different volumes of water that you're referring to then. I can give 1,000 liters of water over 20 square meters, and it's going to be a lot less water than giving that 1,000 liters of water over 5 square meters. So I'd like to challenge you to go and have a look, just to work out what the millimeters per hour is that you're giving, and start referring to millimeters per hour. Does that make sense, or am I just running rampant here now? The biggest thing you don't want to do, and this is something the previous time I came to Australia, in some of the more irrigated areas, the infiltration rate of that soil might be 10 millimeters per hour, but the irrigation amount they're putting down was about 20 millimeters in that hour. And all that you get then is water ponding on the top of the soil, and it's just sitting there, these shimmering ponds. So if you don't know that, you're going to make a bad decision. You're going to make an ill-informed decision about what you're doing on that specific farm. Okay. I know my trees have a rooting depth of about 30 to 40 centimeters. I dug a trench. I saw that. I'm happy with that. All right. And my site that I'm farming on is known for having a dry spring and an extremely wet summer. So flowering time is particularly dry on my site where I'm farming my macadamias. But then if we get into November and December and January and February, I've got some good rain that I can count on. And it usually starts in October, it stops in April of every year. And I've got an annual rainfall of 1,500 millimeters. This is not a South African farm, unfortunately, but I chose a little bit of Australia here. So 1,500 millimeters of rain on my farm, and my annual evapotranspiration is 1,600 millimeters. All of that data I got from long-term weather data sitting somewhere on the internet for my site. And it's pretty easy to obtain. But just from that, I can say already there's 100 millimeters deficit. I know I'm going to get 100 millimeters deficit, and that's why I most likely chose to do a bit of irrigation. And you can do that on a monthly basis as well. You can go and take what your monthly rainfall, long-term monthly averages were, and your long-term monthly average rainfall is, and long-term monthly average evapotranspiration, and see in which months is there the biggest deficit in water. Does it make sense? Yes.
The major problem we have with rainfall, we might get a 200 or a 300 millimetre hit at once,
yep.
And then you might not get anything for for quite some time,
Yep.
and then you might get another. So you get a lot of runoff. So we actually don't.
It's not a good indication though then, hey? But that's exactly the type of, if I was a new farmer in Australia and looking purely at weather data, I would have said, but there's no need to irrigate in this place because I'm getting more water than is actually leaving, yeah? But the distribution of that rainfall is a whole different story. But before you plan an orchard or before you start thinking about an irrigation system, it's those types of background information you need to take into account. That maybe the rainfall distribution patterns in December is pretty good. We get rain almost every week. Then irrigation might not be necessary in December. And you can stretch your water up till December, but you might get a 200 ml shower in December at the beginning and nothing for the rest of the month. But then that will influence a whole bunch of decisions that you need to make. Maybe I should put on a dam or try and store some water if I can somewhere to try and stretch the water I'm giving in or getting in, try and stretch that out over the years. Maybe I could increase my infiltration rate of my soil to capture more of that. And how do I, if I don't understand what the infiltration rate is of my soil, how can I improve on that? Those types of figures, just to try and see if I can get more of that water into the soil. Yeah, but it is a good point. That's a very good point. All right. So basically, on my farm, I'll install a weather station over my shortly mown grass surface because I need the information. And for the grass surface, it will give me a good indication to calculate my own daily evapotranspiration. And my weather station will do that. It's built in. You don't have to go and do a lot of calculations for that. And then I'll install one tensiometer in each of my orchards. Even though I've got the same soil type across the orchard, I'll put one of those measurement probes in every single one of my blocks. Okay? If I've got 10 blocks, hopefully I've got 10 irrigation blocks, different ones, and I'll have 10 different cultivars or whichever way, but I'll put one of those probes in every block because I want to manage them separately.
With probes, how do you judge what depth in a probe in relation to the root or the bottom?
So there's a bit of combination of both. So if you determining, the question was, how do I determine where I put my probes then and what depths? Firstly, you want to definitely put something within the root zone of the tree because you want to know if water's getting there and if the roots are happy or not. So where the majority of the roots are. And macadamias, the majority of those roots are typically situated in the top 300, if you're lucky, top 300 centimeters or 300 millimeters of the soil is where most of them. So you at least want one sensor there. And then you at least want another sensor below the root zone to see if irrigation is running past that root zone and you're overwatering or water's not just going past and you're washing away a lot of stuff. Preferably, I'd like to see a lot of them come in pairs of 3. So I'll do one at 20 centimeters, one at 40 centimeters, and one at 60 centimeters. Some of the soils won't even be that deep. That's one of the things. Looking at some of the soils we had yesterday, I definitely would have wanted to know, in those clay soils, is that clay busy drying out or not? If the clay is busy drying out, I might want to put a little, and I've got the water, I might want to irrigate a little bit more just to keep that clay happy at the bottom. Sometimes, once a month or twice a month, just put in a longer cycle to wet it up again and keep it happy. But it is going to depend on your soil type as well. If you've got deep draining sands, you want to use that bottom sensor as a policeman to see if you're not just running water past the root zone there. Okay, so then most of my, I'll closely monitor my soil moisture from April to September because I know I'm not getting any rain from April to September. My rain only starts in October. And it becomes a little bit difficult if I want to start monitoring in October and the rain comes. I might want to stretch it a little bit, 1 or 2 days further just before the rain comes, and then your soil moisture probes become less critical. But in those dry times, you actually want to be on top of it. You want to, because it's the only source of water that the trees will get during that time. Okay. So I'll measure them closely, and then I'll only irrigate enough to wet the top 40 centimeters of my soil. That's just my farm. I've got these red soils though, so I know my water is only going to get 3 hours of irrigation or 4 hours of irrigation. It's getting into that zone, and I'll just try and limit the amount of water. Keep it in that 400 centimeters. Keep the trees happy. That's where their food is. That's where a lot of their roots are. And I'm trying to keep them happy within that zone so that they don't go into these extreme stress events that Dan was talking about as well. So try to keep them happy in that top root zone. And then I'll install a pair of wetting front detectors. I don't think we've spoken about the wetting front detectors. I'll draw you one now on the board and tell you what a wetting front detector is. But it's an absolutely brilliant tool, and I really love them. But we can get to them now. All right, let's do that first. There's a marker here. All right, so a wetting front detector is also, oh my goodness, is also an Australian-made tool which very few people use, but it's basically a funnel. So I'm going to try my best artistic skills. This is the top of the soil. Can everybody see that? Okay, this is the top of the soil. Then about 400 down into the soil. There's that. Then there's a funnel which you install here. That's what the wetting front detector looks like. That might be the best one I've drawn up to this point. It is? Oh, thank you very much. Okay, it's been 4 courses. So the wetting front detector is this little funnel that you put into the soil, and it's got a pipe that goes up like that. And within that pipe, it's got these little polystyrene floats. Okay, those polystyrene floats sit stacked on top of one another here. And now what happens is I start irrigating. Okay, turn on the irrigation, or it rains, or whatever happens, and the water starts infiltrating into the zone, and it does exactly what the name says it does. It detects the wetting front. Okay, so the wetting front goes through, it fills up this part here, and as soon as this starts filling up, these polystyrene floats pop up, and there's a little thing that goes up, book, goes up to the top, and you can actually see, the water's gone down to 400, all right, which is more or less where I wanted it. It's in my root zone, okay? And then the beauty of this is it comes in 2 pairs, okay? So there's another pair that I then put in the 600. I'm just going to draw a block here, and the 600 to see if it's actually washed past the root zone. Okay, the water's gone past my root zone of the 400, 300, 400 where I'm at, and it's got the exact same pipe running through, and something will pop up again if the water has run through there. The best part of them is not necessarily just seeing where the water is going. They've got a spaghetti tube at the bottom, okay, and they come with a big syringe. Like in the box, it's got one of those big syringes. And you can draw the water from the bottom of this funnel with that syringe. You draw the water out, and you can buy at your local swimming pool store, go and buy a packet of nitrate test strips. Okay, you draw the water out there, you put a few drops of water on those nitrate test strips and see if there's nitrates in the water. Okay, if you see the nitrates in the water, it means the nutrients that you've applied have just washed through the profile. It's fine if it's in the 400. If it washes down to the 600, you know you're just leaching nutrients. And it's a good monitoring tool. $120 for 2.
120 for the pair, and they're called full stop.
Full stop wetting front detectors. They're very nice tools to have on your farm though. And that's why what I've said on my farm, what I want to do is during the raining season, I'll use my probes to determine how far. This is my soil moisture probes. I'll determine how far I can push out before I need to irrigate again. I'll see how far I need to go before I need to irrigate again. And then I'll use my wetting front detectors during the raining season to see if I leach nutrients out of the system, or do I need to adapt my irrigation or my fertilizer program accordingly. So in these high rainfall areas that you're sitting in, if you had let's say we applied a lot of our fertilizer last week, and this week we get a big rainfall event of 150 millimeters, have I just washed all my nutrients out of the soil again? And this is typical of what happens in a lot of these high rainfall areas. So then the tree is most likely got enough food, but it's just ran out of, it's got enough water, it just ran out of food. And that's sometimes also a limiting factor in a lot of these areas. All right. And then, did you unhide them, Leonie?
I didn't.
Oh, okay. So then the other thing is, I'll take care of, I'll really take care of when premature nut drop takes place, because one of the things we've seen, or some of the research I've done shows, is that once trees have got a crop on them, their stomatal responses to environmental variables is a little bit different. Okay, so the trees push a little bit harder, they use a little bit more water when they've got a crop on them. It's like taking care of your kids. You always work a little bit harder if you've got kids and they need a lot of school money for school trips and all the rest of the stuff. You tend to work a little bit harder to make sure that you can get them up and running and all the rest of the stuff. And that's exactly the same that happens with trees. The trees tend to work a little bit harder if they've got a crop on them versus when they don't have a crop on them. Yes?
With the funnel thing, I mean, that's probably really useful for irrigated farms, but would it also be useful in non-irrigated areas to sort of get a sense of if you've got a dump of 20 or 100 mil over a certain period of time, what sort of impact that's having through the soil profile? Would that also help?
Definitely. So the question is, is this only useful for irrigation farmers, or could it also be useful for rain-fed farmers? And I would say it's useful for both. If you're getting a rainfall event and you're not getting water, maybe let's say you had 50 millimeters. If 50 millimeters is not moving through your soil profile, something's wrong. If it's not wetting the entire soil profile from 50 millimeters, you either have a huge amount of compaction, which is limiting the infiltration rate, and it also depends on that duration of rainfall. If you get 50 millimeters in 2 minutes, no soil's got as high infiltration rate. But if it's been over the entire day and it hasn't filled up, there's something else wrong. You've got a compaction problem somewhere, or something's wrong in the soil, and you need to think about what you're going to do. But it is a good tool for both, and for non-irrigated farmers, it's still a good nutrient measuring tool, monitoring tool in the soil. Okay.
How would you install these without causing any preferential flow issues? Because you've dug up all that soil, you wouldn't merely own any compaction there.
That is always a tricky one. What we've actually seen, we try and do a little bit of displacement. So you dig a trench and then go and carefully, especially the top layer, so you dig on the side and then move it in. Does it make sense? I'll try and draw it though. You know what I'm saying? So I'll rather dig on this side and then install it towards that side. So install it like that, more or less. And then you also need to take care where you're putting it on the landscape. So if you disturb soil on this side, it's not down the hill and running into that. But it is always a preferential flow is always an issue. Yes.
Just a quick question: would you block the funnel that no soil falls in there?
No, the funnel's open. The funnel is open. You get here at the bottom. You get some extremely, almost like the white sand we saw in your place yesterday. You get these extremely fine washed white sand, which will stop any blockages from going into the pipe. But there's some good instructions on those wetting front detector boxes that takes you step by step of what you want to do. There's also some good information on their website with regarding.
Whereabouts do you put them in relation to the trunk of the tree?
All right, so if you've got irrigation, so the question is, where do I put them in relation to the trunk of the tree? So because of your high rainfall events, you also don't want to put them too close for the big reason that you're getting a lot of stem wash that we've seen now. Okay, so if the tree is here and irrigated, non-irrigated?
Non-irrigated.
Non-irrigated. As the trees are overlapping here, I'll put them slightly to the left or to the right where the trees are overlapping. In the middle of the row, more or less there, is where I would like to put them, at the furthest end of the system. Alrighty. Question?
We actually have lysometers that have been around for 30 years or more.
Okay.
Which is very similar to your tensiometer, exactly the same, gypsum block on the end with a tube inside a tube and a little tap on there, and you just extract the nutrients.
That is fantastic.
Without having the disturbing of the soil. It's just drilled down. I'm only talking 15 millimetre, maybe 18 millimetre.
Wow. That's awesome. I've never heard of them before, but that's a good tool. I think one needs to incorporate a nutrient management tool as well in these systems, not just look at water, water and nutrients.
Nutrient in the soil, water it captures.
Definitely, that's the best thing one needs to do. You need to take both into account. That's pretty critical. You can't separate water from nutrients in any of these systems. Okay. You've got a contact maybe for it? All right. Thanks. All righty. And those questions were from another group. So we'll tackle the questions on the board here. If there's nothing else on this, yes?
Where you have it there, if it's in an irrigated system,
Yep.
where would you put it? Same place?
A little bit. I prefer if it's micro irrigated or drippers. If it's sprinkler irrigators, if this is the middle of the tree, I'd rather put it on the outer edge here. But it's always difficult with your mechanical harvesters. So with your situation, in the Australian situation, I'll still keep it in the middle of the row, but somewhere halfway between the outer edge of the canopy and the stem of the canopy. So also not beneath the micro, depending on where the micro is. So halfway more or less between where the sprinkler is and where the edge of the drip line of that sprinkler is.
So yeah, my sprinklers are in the middle of 5 metres, so they're 2.5 off each tree.
Yep. So I'll shift it in between the middle of that. Yeah. Alrighty. Shall we tackle all the questions? Dan is sleeping already. Oh. Water budgeting. That was, if you've got a limited amount of water, where would you apply it though? Is that what we meant by water budgeting? I think I'll start off with that. I think it's critical, like we just said, you first need to get some background information about your farm and try and see more or less when you are expecting when you're expecting rainfall and when you're not expecting rainfall. And also then try and see, personally, like Dan has also said, you have to focus on that early flowering period, and most of our production scenarios, it's where we're running out of water. It's no rainfall during that time of the year most of the time, and that's when you need it the most. But I'd say, that's my opinion, you first need a lot of background information about where you're expecting rainfall and rainfall distribution patterns in your area. It will help you a great amount just to know that before you can get a water budget.
And the period, a bit of observation in Bundaberg with putting the water on, coming into flowering, that it's probably 2 or 3 weeks prior to the actual flowers emerging that you start leading into that period. You don't want any stress coming into the floral emergence. There's pretty much a direct link between how wet the blocks were in July and when the flowers came out. Delayed flowering in Bundaberg in blocks that were where the irrigation was started up too late coming out of winter. So I'm not sure if it had too much of an effect. Like we had some flowers that are only 50 mils coming out really late if water was put back on too late after July, August, reintroduction of irrigation. So just don't wait till the flowers are coming out to put the water on, probably 2 or 3 weeks prior to that at the latest, to relieve any stress coming into flowering.
I also, the other thing one needs to remember with any type of flush or vegetative growing part or flower is that you need water pressure for elongation. I've tried to explain this in terms of, just a clown blowing one of those long balloons. If you don't have enough water in the system to elongate that balloon, so you don't have enough pressure to get that elongation, you are going to end up with those short little flowers. So as Dan's correctly said, if you're running out of water in flowering or just before flowering, you always see short flowers on dryland trees because they just don't have the pressure to push it out. Okay. And then use in each phenological cycle. Everybody happy with this? Dan's covered this quite extensively in his stuff. Okay. Irrigation scheduling and over-irrigating pitfalls. So this one I think we've covered a little bit, but there are some downfalls to over-irrigating. I think one of the biggest ones would definitely be the increased risk of Phytophthora, which you all know, and oxy conditions are never good. But the other thing is as well, we can't separate nutrients from water. And if you over-irrigate, you're going to leach more nutrients and you're going to get a less productive system. So applying more water is not better. It's definitely not better. It's applying water effectively that is better. Okay. Any other questions here? This one? And stress indicators and management? Covered that? Everybody happy? Monitoring tools? Happy with that? Cost-benefit analysis of irrigation. I think it's a very difficult one because it's going to depend on situation to situation and what type of soil you're dealing with. That when we went to Bruce's place yesterday, if you've got that shallow water table, irrigation will still benefit you in these dry times, and if that water table dries out, you're gonna wish you had some irrigation. But I think in a normal wet year, you might actually be fairly on par with irrigation, or it might be very marginal in terms of the irrigation or the benefit of having irrigation. But if you don't have that type of soil, I would say I would wager a bet that you can add about 1 ton to 1.5 tons a hectare on some of those varieties or some of those soils. Dan?
Yeah, just coming back to that cost-benefit analysis on capital for irrigation, and if you're only going to be able to irrigate part of the orchard, from a sandalwood, there are a lot of good money being thrown at bad trees, and if say you're copping a 50% reduction in productivity through drought across all of your trees, but your better produced trees running at 5 tonnes, you've lost 2.5 tonnes to the hectare, but your poorer trees running at 2 tonnes, you've lost 1 tonne to the hectare, then in that type of situation, I think you're better off putting your irrigation on your better trees. Depending, it's obviously going to be unique to your situation, but if you could, but yeah, a 50% loss on good trees is much more than a 50% loss or gain on poor trees.
Run the next one, sir.
What's the cost of irrigation?
It varies, but I think running at around, say, $30 to $50 per tree for the infrastructure for an irrigation system, depending on the scale and emitter type. Varietal differences. I haven't actually quantified it properly, but there's a significant difference in the water usage between the hybrids and the integrifolias. The hybrids tend to be more vigorous. They tend to use more water. They tend to be more functional for longer periods of the day. But they also tend to be more sensitive to water stress. Not all the varieties, but and sometimes taking the A varieties too far north. I don't think the A variety, the hybrids that go that well in emerald. They haven't been planted there. The intergraphilia seem a lot tougher, but that's just my general observation rather than too many measurements.
Quick question. Just the over-irrigation one reminded me of something. When you mentioned before in a scenario where they were dumping 500 litres or 700 litres, but it was like all on one day, and so there was a massive loss going through. If when you use liquid fertiliser, if they were liquid fertiliser with that, is that also losing the fertiliser, or does the fertiliser?
No. They're soluble fertilisers. Soluble. You can't extract them by filtering them through a soil. They'll stay in the water. So
that's a loss of.
Yeah, it's absolutely. Yeah, soluble fertilisers won't come out of solution into the soil, and then you just no. Wherever your water's going, that's where your nutrients are going.
Just before we go there too, please, we spoke about the capital cost of installation. What about maintenance and depreciation?
Yeah, I guess it also comes back to if you do it properly at the start, then your maintenance costs are reduced. I don't actually have figures. I don't know about that actually. The figures behind the per hectare maintenance costs on different systems.
Some of the benchmarking stuff, running and maintenance came out at around $345 a hectare annual.
So that's $350 a hectare to maintain your irrigation systems. Yeah. Per annum. It's about $1 a tree.
Erosion control and drainage management. I think it's such a different system though, but I think
It's the opposite of what we're talking about.
it is the opposite of what we're talking about. We're trying to get water into the soil, but I think it still remains fairly critical though. Those two are a little bit different, but erosion control, I think it comes down to, like we said in Phil's orchard yesterday, trying to understand what the infiltration rate in that top layer of the soil is. Already just doing that, and increasing infiltration rates in soils will lead to a significant reduction in erosion control. And if you're doing this via just loosening the soil, or putting some vegetation cover there to decrease the amount of erosion that you're getting, both of them could work pretty easily. And then drainage management, depending on what type of water you've got at the bottom and how you're getting the water out of your field, I don't know too much. We've never struggled with too much water in South Africa, but I think you guys have got this pretty much under control in most orchards. I don't know. I do get the feeling that with the LiDAR and all those things, you guys have got this pretty much under control and understanding how to get water out of orchards.
And that probably would go hand in hand with that soil mapping and soil classification that you've done right at the beginning.
Yeah, I think so. You're 100% correct. I just get the feeling in general, you guys know how to deal with a lot of water. I might be wrong, but
Generally, it's a bigger problem on the hills, on the flat country.
Yep.
It's usually not a problem because it doesn't move quick enough to cause erosion, and you just need big drains.
oh, let's skip that one. Tree water use guidelines. This is a bit broad, but I think, should we go into detail about tree water use guidelines?
I think you've done some of that. So what you're watering is where your roots are. You have to understand where the roots are, understand that irrigation, understand how much the atmosphere is taking, the soil availability. I think it's bringing everything that we've said together today.
Okay. All right, and then increasing productivity. This is my the one I usually get beaten up by, but I've been saying this, the previous Northern Rivers group, that everybody was waiting, irrigation, that's going to solve all our problems. It's a good tool, and I still believe it is. It's a very good tool to get you up to your 7 tons. You're not going to get to 7 tons a hectare without irrigation. I'll put that right up front. But there's a lot of other factors that you also need to do right before you can get to high tonnages per hectare. So you need healthy soil, you need good nutrient management and good water management, vigor control, good pruning, all those types of factors before you can just get to high productivity. There's no shortcut there. There's no one thing you can do right to get to the 7 tons per hectare mark. I've been saying to a lot of South African growers as well, as we've gone through the system, I've been saying to them, you might be getting 6 or 7 tons now, and this year it might have been a good one, but the real proof is if you can get 6 or 7 tons 3 or 4 years in a row, then you know you've done a good job. And doing that is not that it's definitely not just in water and how you manage that water. There's a whole bunch of other factors which you need to take into account if you want to get there. I'll love to hear Dan's opinion about it, but I think there's some validity in having everything right there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you get everything else right, and then you get your irrigation right, and then you'll get into high productivity. It doesn't, just because you get your irrigation right doesn't mean you're getting the high productivity. The only really data I've seen from this area was a study done in Clunes, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, fully irrigated versus non-irrigated, and they took it from 10 to 20 kilos per tree in the irrigated years. So that's the scale of the difference. If you get everything right, you might hit 3, but if you get everything right and you get the irrigation on and right, you get 6. So you can make exceptional improvements in productivity with irrigation, assuming you're getting all your ducks lined up for those seasons.
And I think, sorry Dan, I think in the previous courses you and Theunis have spoken about understanding what that limiting factor is,
Yeah, so that was more Theunis's.
Dan's just passing the mic though. I was saying to growers, it's pretty critical and that's where everything comes down to measurements. And Dan has put it nicely in Afrikaans the other day for a video. And in Afrikaans it goes like this: it's om te meet is om te weet. So to measure is to know. And that's a direct translation. And it's one of those things we've been preaching to growers, is that don't tell me you've got bad production if you haven't measured it yet. So you actually need to go and show me that you've done proper soil analysis. Show me where the yield is coming from. From which blocks are you getting better yields than from other blocks? If you can identify some of those variables and you get some yield mapping in there on all these other factors, then we zoom in on a specific area and we know, all right, this field extrapolating trees is giving 10 tons a hectare. So we're getting 30 kgs a tree, and this little spot here in the corner of your farm, why are we getting 30 kilograms a tree here? And once we know that, then we can go and have a look why we don't have that in other blocks. It might be that your limiting factor is not water or nutrients or pruning, but that there might be an acid sulfate layer somewhere down below which we don't know about. And it could be a small block in an entire orchard that is not doing well. And that's all those types of things. I think you have to try and identify what's the main limiting factor in that orchard. You tick off the box there. You say, all right, I've taken care of soil health, tick that. Okay, I've taken care of nutrient management, tick that. And once you've ticked all the boxes, then we can go and refine and try and get an idea of what that major limiting factor is and how do you overcome that specific factor. But there's no one-size-fits-all approach. If I had to come up with a little manual to tell you, all right, this is the amount of nutrients you apply, this is the cultivar you want to plant. If you do all these things correctly, then you'll get 7 tons. It never happens like that. It happens on paper, doesn't happen in the field because there's so many limiting factors. the area you're sitting in now, I think environmentally you're pretty well suited to macadamias. It looks like a very good area for macadamias. But you're going to have, you can push a whole bunch of, environment's not the limiting factor. The biggest limiting factor is most likely getting water to irrigate with, and trying to get those systems up and running and all those types of things, and social licenses and all of those types of things those are limiting factors to your production. Limiting factors aren't necessarily just having water and putting it on that's going to solve the world's problems. And I think that's where, when we went to the Northern Rivers, I was saying to them, you can put on irrigation there, but first you need to sort out canopy management first and sort out all the insect problems you have first. And once you've sorted out those factors, then you revert to irrigation and to try and make it from 4.5 to 5.5 or whatever tonnages they're getting. Everybody looks super tired. All righty. I think that's us. Any other questions?
It's to Dan. Dan, do you look at irrigating your small trees different to the bearing trees, and that you want to get a deep root system for anchorage and stuff?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of effort in Bundaberg, and because the expansion is so quick and the science is so slow to catch up to the massive expansion, all the growers are realising the importance of resilient large root systems, and as a result they're chopping. There's a lot of hedging and early pruning, multiple pruning, like multiple hedging rounds to try and develop bigger root systems compared to the crown and make them less susceptible to wind throw, and a lot of money getting thrown at that. There's synthetic auxins getting fertigated onto the young plantations in an effort to increase the root to shoot ratio, is my understanding of the logic behind it. But I think you can do a lot of that without lifting a hedger. You could do a lot of that with water by driving, again, holding the soil moisture levels lower by giving little bits more frequently, lowering the soil nitrogen levels, so not big whacks, so that if you hold the soil nitrogen levels lower, you hold the soil moisture levels lower. I'm not talking about restricting and droughting the trees. I'm just putting smaller amounts on and maintaining a reduced soil moisture and a reduced soil nitrate level. The trees will allocate more resources below ground, and you can develop those root systems without having to do any physical manipulation of the trees, and you'll actually get, because you're taking material off by hedging these trees, see it with the 203s especially, you're dropping that biomass on the ground, you're setting the production of these trees back. There's no two ways about it. And I'd rather see that be done with irrigation practices rather than hedges. I think you're destroying the structure of some of these trees by pruning too heavily too early.
Any other questions?
When would you expect to start pruning when you first start shaping the tree?
Well, it all depends on your density. So if you were going on a 4.5 by 1.5 metre high density planting, you'd probably start hitting them pretty early. But if you're on an 8 by 4 or with A203s, then I don't understand the rationale behind pruning the tree for structure, because the A203 is an amorphous mess, and you're not improving the structure of an A203 internally. You're making it more complex, but it's going to be complex anyway. So I understand that if you push a 741 too hard with bulk water, bulk nitrogen, it'll throw big water shoots out, and that you lose your structure that way as well. So I understand pruning them to maintain a more compact tree in a 741. But I honestly think that with the correct water and nutrient management, you can get a 35-year-old plantation running at 6 tonnes to the hectare without ever having pruned any of your trees.
Even in areas where there's massive rainfall events?
It's different in Mackay because it's hot and it's not just VPD, but temperature drives growth as well. So in some of the more tropical regions, I think pruning to maintain a better root shoot ratio might be unavoidable. But this is just all opinion.
Just talking on A203s and what you've seen in the Clarence Valley yesterday, do you think they could be viable down here?
Yeah, I mean, they don't like the really extreme hot environments, so it's probably worth trialling them down here in the more mild environments. I'd say they'd be more suited to here than Emerald, and definitely worth a crack.
Do you want to talk about why you put them on an orchard? Why they're being grown in Bundy?
They produce large kernel early, and the yields. There's some DPI trials at Bundaberg where we're getting substantial yields out of the high density plantations. I think everyone likes them in the mix because 741 might not come into full production until after year 5, but years 3 and 4 we're getting a pretty good payback on the 203s. So I think that early production, early income and early returns is pretty enticing, yes.
On A203s, they're not like A4s and A16s where they pump it out early and then...
Oh, I've seen them do that too, and I've seen there's some issues with set on 203s, millions of bees and ridiculous flowering events and no set, but that's on the more mature trees. So there might be some type of vigor control required in those latter years on those things. So, and the variability of the performance in different regions is amazing.
Any other questions? I had one. We went to some of the orchards yesterday and they seemed to be like these big spaces in between rows and they were, still small trees. Would you intercrop something in between? I know we chatted about this. Theunis or Dan? In the conditions you saw yesterday.
With the current climatic conditions that we have, I would say I won't. I think keep your grass there at the moment. If you are going to intercrop something in there now, especially something with a slightly deeper root system, you are going to dig into that clay and going to take away a lot of that water from the crop at the moment. I'd be very afraid of putting in something during these climatic conditions as an inter-row crop or an intercrop. Under normal circumstances, I think when you've got small trees in the orchard and you're struggling to get water out of the orchards, and if it's not impeding your tractor movement or anything like that, I'd actually advise that if you have that. If you're sitting with a high rainfall area with a low soil water table, and sometimes you actually want a little bit of that water being used, and the tree is not sitting in a wet spot, I would encourage a little bit of intercropping, but definitely not during the scenarios we've been through yesterday, and given the current climatic conditions that we are in.
Okay.
I think Dan is just tired though.
I think Dan's done. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, no one else, this is your last opportunity to ask a question. We're going to finish with, you can have another cup of coffee, and they're just bringing some afternoon tea out. So I just want to say thanks to Dan and Theunis. This has been 2 weeks that they've been up and down our growing regions, and they've been very gracious with the same questions constantly over and over again. So thanks so much for all of that. Like I said, you will get the PowerPoints that were shown today emailed to you. We're endeavouring to try and capture some of what's Theunis and Dan have been saying on video. We've also took some videos before we started this course in one of the orchards to try and put some of this into a simple way that you could refer back to it again. So we've also then done a podcast as well, so that will be released. So make sure that you follow on the e-news, and they'll all be released into that. But if you have any other questions, you're welcome to ask them at afternoon tea. Otherwise, thanks so much for coming.